The medieval world, vast and intricate, unfolded like a tapestry of knights, kings, and cloistered clergy. To the common eye, life was filled with routine. The daily grind of farmers toiling the fields, the tolling bells of village churches, and the occasional royal procession. To many, it was a simple, predictable existence, a world ruled by the relentless passage of time. But beneath this surface, there was something more. A whisper, barely audible, that hinted at hidden truths, concealed for reasons long forgotten. In the heart of Europe, within a small, unremarkable town that had seen the rise and fall of countless dynasties, something curious was happening. It was in a forgotten library tucked away at the edge of a monastery that a dusty old manuscript, neglected and overlooked, was discovered by accident. It wasn't much to look at. A bound collection of fragile parchment, its pages yellowed with age, its ink faded and illegible in some places. To anyone else, it would have been dismissed as mere relic, a forgotten artifact with no more worth than an old piece of firewood. But for the few who stumbled upon it, the manuscript would be the first key that unlocked a chain of events that would send ripples through time. This was a time when knowledge wasn't easily shared. Books were treasures, passed from hand to hand, copied by monks in the quiet of their candlelit chambers, and hidden away in the deepest recesses of libraries that only the most dedicated could access. Even the most well-meaning scholars knew there were boundaries, places where truth was left unsaid, where secrets were buried. And so it was that this innocuous manuscript, overlooked by so many, contained knowledge that had been deliberately hidden away from the world. At the time, no one realized that within its pages was the foundation of a mystery that could forever alter history. The monastery had long been a symbol of religious power, its grounds filled with scholars dedicated to preserving the teachings of the Church. But as the manuscript was uncovered, it became clear that this was no ordinary text. What began as a simple discovery quickly spiraled into something much greater. The manuscript was written in a language few could understand, a language that hadn't been used for centuries. Its symbols were familiar yet foreign, hinting at a forgotten civilization whose influence had seeped into the very fabric of medieval life without anyone knowing it. The revelation wasn't immediate. At first, the scholars dismissed it as a mere curiosity. But the more they uncovered, the more the manuscript seemed to resist explanation, as if it were alive, breathing in the mysteries of an ancient world long buried in the dust. The significance of the discovery was almost imperceptible, a barely noticeable shift in the grand scheme of history. But what if this very moment, the unearthing of a seemingly trivial artifact, was the beginning of something far greater than anyone could have imagined? What if an ancient enigma had remained silent, hidden from the world for centuries, waiting to finally reveal itself when no one was looking? The manuscript was the first piece, the opening chapter in a story that would challenge everything humanity thought it knew about its own past. This was no longer just a story about dusty parchments and forgotten texts. The stage had been set. The story had begun, though it was still far from understood. As the manuscript's secrets began to unfurl, a question echoed in the minds of those who dared to study it. What if this was just the beginning of a much larger mystery, one whose implications had yet to be realized? The small medieval town lay quietly beneath a sky painted with the shades of dusk, its cobblestone streets carrying the weight of centuries. For those who lived there, it was just another humble town. no different from hundreds of others scattered across Europe. But buried beneath its mundane surface was a secret so deep, so veiled in history, that even the locals, accustomed to the town's timeless nature, had forgotten it. Nestled at the far edge of town, hidden in the shadow of the abbey, was the library. Once revered as a center of knowledge, it now stood as little more than a whisper of the past. Its stone walls choked with ivy, its wooden doors long sealed. Stories had circulated for years that the library had been consumed by flames in a devastating fire, its precious manuscripts lost to the ravages of time. To those who had only heard tales of its grandeur, it was little more than a footnote in the annals of history. But like so many things forgotten by time, the truth of what had happened to it was far different from the stories passed down. In the early 19th century, a scholar named Elias Moore stumbled upon the library's remnants by chance. It was not his intention to search for lost relics. He was simply passing through the town on his way to another project. Yet, there was something about the old abbey's crumbling exterior that drew him in, as if an invisible hand had guided him to the very spot where history had been buried. The doors, though seemingly sealed for generations, creaked open as if they had never been closed at all. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew filled his nostrils. Forgotten shelves sagged under the weight of their contents, covered in layers of time and neglect. At first, there was nothing extraordinary about the scene. The walls, though worn, held their secrets close, and the books, untouched for centuries, seemed almost mocking in their silence. There were no grand revelations, no symbols that immediately struck Elias as significant. Instead, the shelves were lined with the familiar: scrolls, manuscripts, and tomes detailing the lives of saints, kings, and battles long past. They were ordinary relics of an age now slipping from memory, nothing more than the detritus of history. Yet, as he wandered deeper into the shadowed corners of the library, his fingers brushed against something odd. A single book, its leather cover cracked with age, sat on a shelf that had been largely ignored. It didn't look like much, its presence subtle among the far more well-preserved volumes that surrounded it. But there was something strange about it. The title was worn, its lettering indecipherable, as if the book had been intentionally obscured, hidden in plain sight. Without thinking, Elias reached for it. The weight of the book was surprisingly heavy, its pages thick with age, and yet it had an undeniable allure. He opened it with care, each turn of the page revealing writing in a language he couldn't quite place, a script that seemed to shift and change as his eyes moved over it. It was a discovery so small, so unremarkable, that had it not been for his keen eye and chance curiosity, it might have gone unnoticed for yet another century. Little did Elias know, that single moment, unnoticed by the world, was the spark that would ignite a mystery, unlike any before it. What was hidden inside those darkened shelves? What had been left behind, left to rot in silence for so long? As Elias began to decode the strange text, he had no idea that the very question no one had thought to ask was waiting for him, just beyond the veil of history. Elias Moore's discovery of the forgotten manuscript did not, at first, seem extraordinary. He had spent many years among the dusty shelves of ancient libraries, his fingers tracing the outlines of faded parchment, searching for forgotten knowledge. This particular book, found among others that had long been dismissed, seemed nothing more than another oddity, its language unfamiliar, its symbols obscure. To Elias, it appeared more like the kind of philosophical ramblings common in religious texts of the period, a product of an old, misunderstood mind. There were no obvious clues pointing to something of world-altering significance. He made a few notes in his journal, scribbled down some translations, and set it aside. For weeks, the book sat in his study, overlooked as he returned to more pressing academic pursuits. The manuscript, a relic that had once been revered but forgotten in time, had been relegated to the same obscurity from which it had emerged. And so it might have stayed, an obscure document with no more importance than the hundreds of others scattered in libraries across Europe, if not for the strange coincidences that began to unfold. At first, they were subtle, almost imperceptible. Elias, still caught up in his daily routines, noticed nothing out of the ordinary. But the events began to multiply, and the scholarly community that had once ignored the manuscript began to take notice. It started with small things, an odd recurring reference to the manuscript in unrelated texts from different regions, centuries apart. Some scholars, when revisiting ancient works, began finding similar references to the same cryptic symbols that Elias had noted in his own translations. These were not direct quotes, nor was the language identical, but the themes were unsettlingly familiar. There were mentions of a great turning, the unseen, and the buried truth. Phrases that echoed through the corners of forgotten libraries in ways that had never been noticed before. Then, there were the strange patterns of events, seemingly unrelated occurrences that connected in the most improbable ways. A fire at a neighboring abbey, a strange archaeological find in a distant monastery, a cryptic letter sent by an anonymous source to a scholar halfway across the continent, referencing the same manuscript without ever having seen it. These small coincidences began to accumulate, and slowly, Elias and a growing group of scholars could no longer ignore the fact that the manuscript might hold far more than they had initially believed. And then came the discovery that would change everything. It was another scholar, a researcher named Jonathan Ward, who unearthed the second manuscript, a discovery as accidental as the first. Ward had been exploring a hidden crypt beneath a church in France, hoping to catalogue some of its older forgotten relics. What he found, buried beneath layers of dust and rubble, was an ancient chest. At first glance, it seemed no different from any other chest of relics, simple, unadorned, and locked. The key had long been lost, but the crypt's layout suggested it had been forgotten for centuries. It had been sealed away, untouched, until Ward's team pried it open in the course of their excavation. Inside, there was a book, much older, its pages brittle with age. The cover was bound in a leather that had long since cracked, and the pages inside, worn to the point of near illegibility, held a striking resemblance to the manuscript that Elias had found years earlier. Even the symbols, though more faded and weathered by time, were the same. At first, Jonathan Ward dismissed it as an inconsequential copy of Elias's manuscript, perhaps a variation or an earlier version. But as he delved deeper into the text, he began to see something new, something that Elias had never uncovered. Hidden within the faded ink was a key piece of information, a fragment of writing so subtle and complex that it took Ward weeks to fully decipher. The phrase was simple, almost dismissive in its tone, yet it held profound implications. The key is the key. Ward had no idea what it meant, but it was impossible to ignore the implications. The similarity between the two manuscripts, separated by both time and geography, could no longer be chalked up to coincidence. Something deliberate, something hidden was unfolding before them. A puzzle they had only begun to see. What could the two manuscripts mean? How could two ancient texts, separated by hundreds of miles and centuries, carry the same cryptic symbols, the same elusive message? The phrase, "the key is the key," lingered in their minds, haunting them with the possibility that it held the answer to something far greater than anyone could have imagined. In the days that followed, Elias and Jonathan, along with a select group of scholars, began to piece together what they could. Each new discovery seemed to open the door a little wider, revealing a labyrinth of hidden knowledge and cryptic messages. But the mystery remained. What was the key, and why had it been so carefully hidden? It was clear now that this was not a simple religious manuscript or a philosophical musing. This was something much darker, much deeper. A message intended to remain hidden for reasons no one could yet understand. It wasn't just that the secrets were encoded or obscure. It was the very nature of the manuscripts themselves. The symbols, the language, the way they seemed to overlap and interweave, they were part of something far more complex than any one scholar could comprehend on their own. What if these were not just texts, but keys themselves, unlocking a deeper, more dangerous mystery? The next few months saw an increase in strange occurrences, oddly timed discoveries, whispers among scholars, rumors of groups seeking to uncover the truth hidden within the manuscripts. The mystery was growing, and each piece uncovered only seemed to reveal more questions. But one thing was becoming clear. The answer to this mystery had been waiting in the shadows for centuries. And now, with both manuscripts uncovered, it was slowly starting to emerge. The question remained: what would the key unlock? And who, in the end, would hold it? At first glance, the symbols within the manuscript appeared as little more than a jumble. Arcane, indecipherable, and unlike anything found in the known languages of the time. Each stroke, each curve of the characters seemed to mock the efforts of those who tried to understand them. Even the most seasoned scholars of the day, accustomed to ancient texts and religious manuscripts, found themselves at a loss. The symbols bore no resemblance to any known script, medieval or otherwise, and this led many to dismiss the manuscript as a mere curiosity, perhaps a simple work of fiction or religious ramblings by a long-forgotten mystic. But for Elias Moore, the discovery of the symbols was no trivial matter. There was something about the way they appeared on the page, their deliberate arrangement, that stirred something deep within him. It was a feeling he could not explain, a certainty that they were not random. The manuscript had an unmistakable weight to it, as if it held more than just words. As he stared at the strange characters, an uneasy thought began to grow. What if this was more than a mistake of a mad scribe? What if this was a message, a puzzle meant to be deciphered? Elias was not alone in his obsession. Soon, the manuscript attracted the attention of cryptographers, linguists, and historians, all eager to tackle the enigma. Scholars from across Europe gathered in quiet rooms, poring over the pages, squinting at the symbols under candlelight. Each attempt to decode them ended in frustration, with no breakthrough to speak of. Some believed that the symbols were part of an ancient script that had since been forgotten. Perhaps something lost in the ravages of time, or buried by the very hands that had written it. But as the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, a breakthrough finally came from a young scholar named Isabel Hart. While studying the symbols, Isabel noticed an oddity. A pattern began to emerge. A few of the symbols appeared in multiple places, each time surrounded by the same set of characters. A common theme had begun to reveal itself, something that could not have been coincidental. It was a sequence, she realized. And not just any sequence. A sequence that mimicked the structure of a long-dead language believed to have disappeared long before the medieval period. The ancient language of Sumerian. The realization hit like a jolt of electricity. Could it be? Were the symbols, in fact, a direct reference to a language that had not been spoken for thousands of years? The idea seemed ludicrous at first. Why would a manuscript from the Middle Ages reference an ancient civilization that had long been thought of as irrelevant to the European world? And yet, the similarities were undeniable. The shapes of the symbols mirrored the cuneiform script of Sumerian texts. Triangular forms, angular marks that resembled the markings made in clay tablets. Excitement rippled through the scholarly community. What had once been a trivial puzzle now revealed itself to be a key, one that could unlock the long-lost history of a civilization that had vanished from the pages of history millennia ago. And yet, as the decoding progressed, a strange unease settled over the group. With every symbol they translated, the mystery seemed to grow larger, and the connections to the past seemed undeniable. But there were more questions than answers. Why would someone in medieval Europe have access to such knowledge? Was this the work of a lone scholar, a secretive group, or was there something far darker at play? And most pressing of all, what did this ancient language have to say? And as the first symbols began to translate into coherent words, they revealed something both stunning and troubling. The manuscript spoke of secrets hidden in plain sight, of a knowledge so profound that it could alter everything scholars thought they knew about the world. But with every discovery came greater mystery. What was the manuscript truly trying to tell them? And who else, if anyone, was aware of its existence? The deeper the scholars delved, the more they realized they were no longer simply decoding a script. They were peeling back the layers of a conspiracy that had been carefully woven into the fabric of history itself. As the months passed and the manuscript's cryptic symbols began to yield their secrets, a quiet unease settled over the scholars who were working tirelessly to decipher them. What had started as an academic curiosity was now becoming something far more dangerous. The symbols, once dismissed as the ramblings of an ancient madman, were transforming into a map that pointed toward a hidden truth, one that could unravel everything the medieval world held dear. The more they uncovered, the more the scholars felt the weight of their discoveries, as if each breakthrough had become a step further into a darkened world they were not prepared to enter. Among those studying the manuscript were a number of high-ranking clergy members, men who, while dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge, understood the precarious line they walked. The Church, in all its power, held the keys to both faith and knowledge. But the power of the clergy was not based merely on what was known. It was rooted in what was kept hidden. To open a door to secrets that might challenge the very foundation of Christian doctrine was to risk everything. Father Anselm, a respected theologian and one of the manuscript's most fervent supporters, found himself torn. He was a man of reason, one who had always believed in the sanctity of knowledge. Yet the more he translated from the ancient symbols, the more he began to see the unmistakable traces of a forbidden truth. The manuscript was revealing more than just a forgotten civilization. It was speaking of something far older, far deeper. Something that hinted at a world where the Church's authority may not have been as absolute as history had taught. Father Anselm's enthusiasm, however, was not shared by all. In the darkest corners of the Church, men like Cardinal Bertrand were beginning to hear rumors of the manuscript's contents. Bertrand was a man who understood the balance of power all too well. He had spent his life safeguarding the Church's interests, ensuring that no knowledge slipped past its control. He knew that the manuscript, if its true nature were ever revealed, could shatter the very foundations of Christian belief. As the scholars gathered in secret to discuss their findings, the tension between them became palpable. Some, like Father Anselm, were eager to share their discoveries with the wider world, to uncover the lost truths they believed were meant to be found. But others, equally learned, understood the dangers of such revelations. They had seen what happened to those who dared to challenge the status quo. The burning of heretics, the silencing of inconvenient truths. It was not merely a matter of intellectual pursuit. It was a matter of survival. The deeper the scholars delved into the manuscript, the more they found themselves caught in a struggle not just with the text, but with the very institutions that governed their world. The Church's reach extended far beyond the walls of monasteries and abbeys. It stretched into every corner of society, controlling the flow of knowledge and the power it bestowed. To question the Church was to risk excommunication, even death. And now, with the manuscript hinting at truths that lay outside the scope of Christian doctrine, the stakes were higher than ever before. Father Anselm's once unwavering conviction began to waver. The thought of excommunication was a heavy one, and there were whispers among the scholars of darker fates awaiting those who dared to follow the manuscript's trail. Some began to distance themselves from the project, fearful that their names would be tarnished forever, that their careers would end in disgrace, or worse. Others, however, stood firm, driven by a deeper calling to understand the lost history, no matter the cost. In the shadow of the cathedral's towering spires, a quiet war was being waged. The manuscripts, once a simple collection of forgotten pages, had become a symbol of the battle between knowledge and power. For the first time, the scholars realized the true cost of their pursuit. The secrets they uncovered could change everything. And yet, the question remained, would they be allowed to uncover them? Or would the shadow of the Church, ever looming, silence them before they could finish? The coded symbols, now painstakingly decoded, pointed to a location buried deep within the mountains. An area shrouded in mystery, untouched by time, and veiled in legend. It was a place that had haunted the imagination of scholars for centuries, whispered about in the darkest corners of monasteries, mentioned only in hushed tones by the elders of villages who claimed to have heard of it in their youth. It was known as the Hidden Chamber, or sometimes the Lost Temple. The stories varied, but all spoke of a location so ancient, so sacred, that it was believed to hold secrets capable of reshaping human history. Those who had sought it before had either vanished without a trace or returned, broken and empty-handed. For centuries, the chamber had been nothing more than a myth, a tantalizing rumor that existed at the edge of reality. Now, however, it wasn't just a legend. The manuscript, tattered, fragile, and ancient, had given the scholars the final clue, a set of coordinates, concealed in the form of a series of arcane symbols that pointed directly to the heart of the mountains. Father Anselm and the other scholars had no illusions about the dangers that lay ahead. Despite their initial enthusiasm, they knew they were about to embark on a journey that would demand more than just their intellect. It would require their courage, their faith, and their very lives. No one had ever returned from the lost temple without paying a steep price. Yet the allure of the knowledge it might contain was irresistible. What truths could be hidden in a place so powerful, so forbidden? What might they uncover about the ancient civilization that had once flourished and whose remnants still whispered from the pages of the manuscript? Their journey began in the dead of winter. The air was frigid, the winds howling through the jagged peaks of the mountains. With each step, the landscape became more desolate, the sparse trees giving way to craggy rock faces and treacherous ravines. The path was treacherous, littered with fallen rocks, icy streams, and deep snowdrifts. Yet the scholars pressed on, their determination fueled by the promise of something far greater than they had ever dared to imagine. But the physical obstacles were not their only challenge. As they climbed higher, the ideological ones began to take their toll. The fear of excommunication, of the wrath of the church, gnawed at their minds of Father Anselm. Despite his unwavering commitment to the pursuit of knowledge, found himself doubting the path they had chosen. Every step forward seemed to bring them closer to a line that could never be uncrossed. What if the knowledge they sought was not meant to be found? What if the powers that had kept it hidden for so long were not simply protective, but purposeful? Were they trespassing on something that, once disturbed, could unleash something far darker than they could comprehend? The doubts were not just confined to Father Anselm. Other members of the party, once eager to uncover the secrets of the lost temple, had begun to grow anxious. One scholar, a man by the name of Gregory, quietly suggested they turn back. He spoke of the stories he had heard from older generations, the whispered tales of those who had disappeared in the mountains, leaving nothing behind but their empty camps and ruined equipment. Yet despite these fears, none of them could stop now. Each scholar, at some level, knew they were at the brink of something that could not be undone. And so, driven by the same need for discovery, they pushed onward. As the days passed, the terrain grew harsher, the cold more biting, and the atmosphere more oppressive. The scholars began to feel the weight of the mountains pressing in on them. The air grew thin, their supplies dwindled, and yet they were closer than ever. Then, one evening, as the sun set behind the peaks, casting long shadows over the snow-covered landscape, they found it. Hidden among the rocks, partially concealed by a thick layer of ivy and snow, was the entrance to a cave. It was an unassuming entrance, just a darkened opening in the mountain. But as they approached, a strange sensation washed over them. It was as though the very air around them had changed. The wind ceased, and the quiet felt unnatural, almost as though the world itself was holding its breath. The cave seemed to pulse with an energy that none of them could explain. And despite the mounting fear, they found themselves drawn to it, compelled by a force they could not name. Father Anselm was the first to enter. The others hesitated, but the moment their feet crossed the threshold, they were enveloped in darkness. The light of their torches flickered, casting eerie shadows against the walls as they moved deeper into the cavern. It was cold inside, colder than the mountain air, and yet the air seemed charged with something else. Something ancient, something alive. They ventured further into the labyrinthine depths of the cave, guided only by their torches and the faint glow of symbols etched into the walls. The symbols were unlike anything they had seen before, larger, more intricate, as if they were written by a hand far more skilled than those of the scribes who had created the manuscript. Each mark was carefully crafted, leading them deeper into the heart of the temple, where the walls seemed to close in around them. It was there, in the deepest recesses of the chamber, that they found it. A stone altar, worn smooth by time, its surface covered in ancient glyphs that seemed to shimmer in the torchlight. It was as though the very stone was alive, its markings shifting and changing before their eyes. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The altar was unlike anything they had ever seen, its purpose unclear, yet undeniably sacred. And atop it, nestled within the folds of the stone, was the final piece of the puzzle. An object, small and unassuming, but pulsing with a strange, almost palpable energy. Father Anselm reached out and touched it, his fingers brushing against the cold stone. The moment his skin made contact, the ground trembled beneath them. The air seemed to crackle with an electric charge, and a low hum resonated from deep within the walls. The scholars recoiled, but it was too late. The chamber had awakened, and with it, the secret that had been buried for centuries. The moment they stepped into the ancient temple, the air seemed to thicken. It was as if time itself had stopped, holding its breath in awe of the space that had remained untouched for centuries. The entrance, hidden deep within the jagged cliffs, had led them into a vast underground chamber, a place so profound, it felt both otherworldly and eerily familiar. For the first time since their journey began, the scholars were struck silent, their voices swallowed by the sheer enormity of what they had uncovered. It was a place that seemed to defy all logic, as though it had been waiting for them to arrive, hidden from the eyes of mankind until the precise moment of discovery. The temple was in remarkably good condition, preserved through the ages by the very earth that had concealed it. The walls were adorned with intricate carvings, their surfaces polished smooth by centuries of neglect. Symbols, some similar to those in the manuscript, others completely foreign, covered the stone, winding in elegant patterns, their meaning just beyond the grasp of modern understanding. It was a civilization unlike any they had ever encountered, its grandeur reflected in the imposing architecture and the opulence of the place. Despite the passage of time, the temple still held an air of majesty, as though the hands that had crafted it had imbued it with some lasting power. As their torches flickered in the darkness, the scholars moved slowly through the cavernous hall, documenting everything they could. Every step felt like a descent into the past, as if they were trespassing on something sacred. The walls seemed to hum with an energy that was impossible to ignore, the quiet whispers of a forgotten civilization that had once flourished in this very space. The floor, worn smooth by time, was dotted with strange artifacts, ceremonial objects, relics that reflected the once great culture that had built the temple, and the mystery that now lay buried in its depths. Among the most striking of the temple's features was the altar at the far end of the chamber, large and imposing. its surface intricately etched with glyphs. It was as though the stone itself had been carved by a hand far more advanced than the people who had lived in the surrounding region. The altar seemed to hold a quiet power, and beneath it, hidden in the shadows, was a set of stairs that spiraled downward into a darkened abyss. The very air around them seemed to grow heavier as they moved closer, a sense of dread creeping up their spines. It was an altar that held a secret, one so old, so far beyond their understanding, that it made their discovery feel insignificant in comparison. It wasn't just an artifact. It was a key to unlocking a story buried for millennia. Father Anselm stood before the altar, his hands trembling as he gently ran his fingers twice over the carvings and tracing the lines of a language he could not understand. His voice was barely a whisper when he spoke, as if the temple itself demanded reverence. This is more than a temple. This is a message. It's speaking to us. The other scholars gathered around, drawn by the weight of his words. For a brief moment, they all stood in awe, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what they had just uncovered. What had once been a myth, a legend passed down through centuries, now lay before them, tangible, real, and undeniably powerful. They knew in that moment that they had stumbled upon something far greater than they had ever anticipated. This was not merely an ancient relic of a forgotten people. It was a doorway to a past that had been intentionally erased from history. And as they moved deeper into the temple, they could feel the weight of their discovery pressing in on them. They were not just scholars documenting history. They were uncovering a truth that had been buried so deep, so carefully hidden, that its very existence threatened everything they knew about the past. The walls of the temple were covered in a language as ancient as the stone itself. At first glance, the carvings appeared to be a strange and chaotic mix of symbols, curved lines, sharp angles, and geometric shapes, all etched with meticulous care. The patterns seemed to breathe, to pulse with a quiet energy, as if they were waiting for someone to unlock their meaning. What struck the scholars immediately was how familiar yet foreign the symbols felt. Some of the markings bore an eerie resemblance to the cryptic symbols they had seen in the manuscript, the same ones that had led them here. It was as though the manuscript had been a mere prelude, the first step in a much larger mystery. Father Anselm stood before the wall, his fingers tracing the shapes, his mind racing. These are the same, he murmured, but they are different, more refined, more purposeful. Each symbol was carved into the stone with such precision that it felt as though they were meant to be understood, not just observed. They seemed to speak of something far older than any known civilization. These weren't mere inscriptions, they were a narrative, telling a story in a language long forgotten. As the scholars began to map the symbols against the text in the manuscript, they realized they were decoding a vast, interconnected history. A story that seemed to span not just centuries, but millennia. The deeper they delved into the carvings, the more unsettling their discoveries became. One wall depicted a series of figures, tall, regal beings with elongated features and strange flowing robes. They were shown in various positions, performing ritualistic acts, their eyes large and expressionless. These figures, though clearly humanoid, did not resemble any known human culture. Their proportions were off, too elongated, too symmetrical. And there was something in the way they were depicted, their hands raised to the heavens or positioned as if manipulating the stars, that suggested a deeper knowledge of the universe than anything humanity had yet achieved. And then there were the scenes of great catastrophe, vast landscapes, cities engulfed by fire, oceans swallowing entire continents. These were not mere myths or legends. They were depictions of events that did not align with any known historical records. Some of the carvings showed a cataclysmic event, an extinction-level disaster, with waves of fire consuming the earth. Others depicted strange celestial events, planets colliding, stars burning out. There was no mistaking it. These scenes were not just allegories, they were vivid, horrifying accounts of real events. The implications were staggering. These carvings did not just depict a civilization that had been lost to time. They suggested that this civilization had experienced events that predated any known human history. Could these people have witnessed or even recorded the fall of entire worlds, the destruction of cities, the collapse of empires that were never mentioned in any text, in any record? Were they the last survivors of a long-forgotten era? And if so, what was their connection to the advanced civilization depicted in the manuscript? As the scholars painstakingly worked to translate and interpret the carvings, it became clear that they were no ordinary historical record. They spoke of a timeline that did not fit with the accepted narrative of human history. The civilization depicted in the temple was not just ancient, it was ancient beyond comprehension, stretching back to a time when human civilization had not even been conceived. The more they decoded, the more it seemed like this forgotten people had seen the rise and fall of civilizations that had never been recorded. Events that were buried so deeply in the past that they had slipped entirely from the collective memory of humanity. Father Anselm's voice trembled with excitement and fear as he realized the magnitude of their discovery. What if this is evidence of a civilization so advanced, so ancient, that its history has been completely erased? A civilization that knew things we have only just begun to understand. The scholars exchanged nervous glances, the weight of their words sinking in. If this was true, if these carvings were telling the story of a lost civilization, then it meant that the history of mankind was far more complex and far more mysterious than they had ever imagined. The possibility that history had been deliberately rewritten, that certain truths had been hidden from the world, was now no longer just a theory. It was becoming a chilling reality. As the days passed, the scholars became increasingly consumed by their work. Each new discovery within the temple only deepened the mystery, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to uncover. It happened late one night, as Father Anselm hunched over the stone tablet in the far corner of the chamber, his fingers tracing the intricate carvings that ran across the surface. He had been examining one particular sequence of symbols, trying to correlate them with an ancient lunar calendar they had found in the manuscript, when his eyes suddenly widened. This can't be, he muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper in the cavernous silence. His hand trembled as he beckoned the other scholars over, urging them to look at the series of symbols he had just decoded. The rest of the team gathered around, their faces drawn with exhaustion. But the moment they saw what Anselm had uncovered, they froze. There, embedded in the ancient carvings, was a timeline, a series of events that seemed to stretch far beyond the civilization that had once occupied this temple. The images on the stone began to blur into a narrative, a story not of a lost world, but of a civilization that had not disappeared after all. It was one of the scholars, Isabel Hart, who first made the connection. She had spent countless hours studying the medieval documents that had been recovered from various parts of Europe. And as soon as her eyes fell on the carvings, something clicked in her mind. The symbols that adorned the walls of the temple were not just echoes of an ancient past. They were a reflection of the future. Events that had occurred long after this civilization had supposedly fallen. What if this civilization predicted the future? Isabel whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of the realization. The others stared at her, wide-eyed, as the implications of what she had said began to sink in. The evidence was undeniable. As they scrutinized the carvings further, the scholars were stunned to find symbols that corresponded with specific events in medieval history. There were images of plagues, vast, dark clouds that seemed to devour entire cities, their outlines unmistakably matching descriptions of the Black Death. There were symbols depicting battles and wars, the Crusades, the 100 Years' War, events that had occurred long after the civilization that created the temple had vanished from the historical record. Even more shockingly, there were depictions of kings, rulers whose likenesses had been drawn with uncanny accuracy and whose fates seemed eerily aligned with the rise and fall of monarchs in the centuries to come. Father Anselm stepped back, his mind racing. The temple, the carvings, the manuscript, everything suddenly made sense in a way that it never had before. This was not just a place of worship, nor was it merely a record of a long-lost people. This temple held something far more extraordinary. It held a map of human history, one that stretched well beyond the limits of the civilization that created it. The figures depicted on the walls were not just relics of the past, they were prophecies, or perhaps even the key to understanding how the lost civilization had managed to predict or influence the future. The scholars began to realize that this civilization, which had once appeared so disconnected from the modern world, may have had knowledge that transcended time itself. How could they have known the future? Could it be that their understanding of the universe, of the stars, of time itself, had been so advanced that they had glimpsed the events to come? Or perhaps, more disturbingly, had they somehow managed to influence those events, planting the seeds of chaos and power struggles that would later shape the course of history? The most unsettling part of the discovery was the pattern that began to emerge. The carvings didn't just describe random events. They showed a continuous thread, a series of connected events that appeared to follow a predetermined course. The symbols depicted the fall of empires, the rise of religions, and the shifting power structures in Europe, almost as if this ancient civilization had known the course of history before it happened. The imagery suggested that they had not only foreseen these events, but had somehow left their mark on them, guiding, manipulating, or even orchestrating the very flow of human history. "What does this mean?" asked Gregory, his voice trembling with disbelief. He had spent years studying ancient texts and deciphering codes, but nothing in his career had prepared him for the revelations now unfolding before him. Father Anselm, his mind whirling, stepped forward to answer. "It means this civilization didn't just disappear. It means they knew the future, or at least they had the power to influence it. His voice trailed off as he realized the enormity of their discovery. If this civilization had the ability to predict the future, what else had they known? Had they seen the rise of Christianity, the Reformation, or even the fall of the Roman Empire? Had they known the wars and the plagues that would devastate Europe? And if so, what role had they played in those events? The scholars began to look at each other in disbelief, the weight of their findings sinking in. This civilization was not merely a relic of the past. It was a key to understanding the hidden forces that had shaped the history of mankind. The idea that these ancient people might have influenced the future, that their knowledge could have been passed down through secret societies or hidden texts, was a terrifying thought. What other secrets might they have left behind? And who had been privy to that knowledge? As the scholars worked tirelessly to document their findings, the enormity of what they had uncovered began to set in. They had thought that the temple was simply a forgotten monument to a lost civilization. But now they realized that this discovery went far beyond mere archaeology. This was not just about uncovering the past. It was about re-examining the very foundations of history itself. The implications of their discovery were staggering. Could the rise and fall of entire civilizations be explained by a group of individuals who had access to knowledge far beyond their time? Had this lost civilization managed to influence history from the shadows, shaping the fate of kings, empires, and wars in ways that had never been fully understood? As they began to process the information they had uncovered, one question loomed above all others. Had the true history of humanity been deliberately concealed, hidden behind the veil of time? As the scholars pored over the carvings, symbols, and artifacts discovered in the temple, a single question loomed over them like a shadow. Who were these people? The civilization that had created this marvel, one that defied all known history, remained an enigma. Their knowledge, their craftsmanship, their understanding of the stars, of the earth, and of time itself was far beyond anything the scholars had ever encountered. Yet no records of their existence could be found in the history books. The temple itself, silent and hidden for centuries, was the only testament to their presence. The first hypothesis that emerged was that these architects were not merely a forgotten society, but the forebearers of all the ancient civilizations that followed. The knowledge embedded in the temple was too advanced to be the product of any one isolated culture. It hinted at a much older, more expansive understanding of the world. The scholars speculated that these architects had been masters of technologies and philosophies that had shaped the development of civilizations across the globe. The question was, where did they come from? One theory was that the civilization had its roots in a much older, prehistorical society. Could they have been influenced by the lost knowledge of even earlier cultures? Cultures that had been wiped out by natural disasters or wars. The Sumerians, with their advanced knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and writing, were often mentioned in the same breath as the mysterious architects. Perhaps the creators of the temple had been contemporaries of the Sumerians, or even predecessors, their influence spreading across the ancient world like ripples in a pond. The Egyptians, too, were considered a likely candidate. The similarities between the temple's architectural design and the grand structures of Egypt were undeniable, especially the careful alignment of the walls and the use of intricate yet precise measurements. The temple's carvings also bore a resemblance to Egyptian hieroglyphs, though their meanings were more obscure. as if an older, forgotten script had evolved into the more familiar writing system of ancient Egypt. But it wasn't just the old world that raised questions. The scholars began to wonder if there were connections to even more distant lands, specifically the pre-Columbian civilizations of the Americas. Could the creators of the temple have traveled across the oceans, leaving their mark on distant shores long before the arrival of European explorers? The Olmecs, the Mayans, and the Aztecs all had advanced knowledge of astronomy, architecture, and mathematics. Was it possible that these ancient peoples were influenced by the same civilization that had constructed the temple? Could the same architects have reached across vast distances, bridging the gap between two separate worlds? As the scholars debated these theories, one thing became increasingly clear. The civilization that had built the temple could not have been a mere product of its time. Its knowledge seemed to transcend the boundaries of geography, culture, and even time itself. But as the team continued to dig deeper into the evidence, they realized that these connections, though tantalizing, only raised more questions. No matter how they looked at it, they could find no direct link, no obvious bridge between this civilization and the well-documented cultures of the ancient world. Father Anselm, always the skeptic, wasn't convinced that they would find answers in the realm of ancient connections. "We're chasing shadows," he warned, his brow furrowed as he looked over the latest findings. What if they weren't influenced by anyone? What if they were the originators, the first true masters of civilization, whose knowledge simply disappeared from history, leaving nothing but myths and legends behind? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. If the architects of the temple were indeed the true originators of human civilization, then they were a society unlike anything the world had ever seen. Their understanding of the world, their technology, and their wisdom might have been so advanced that it couldn't be comprehended by later cultures. Perhaps the greatest minds of ancient Greece or Rome had simply inherited fragments of their knowledge, twisting and reshaping it into the foundations of modern civilization. This new line of thinking opened a door to an even more profound mystery. If these architects had the power to shape the course of history, why had they left no trace of themselves? Why had their knowledge been so thoroughly erased from the record? For the scholars, the mystery deepened as they began to hypothesize the origin of the temple's creators. They uncovered tantalizing clues that hinted at a deeper conspiracy, one that suggested these ancient architects may have deliberately hidden their knowledge from the world. But the answer to that question, and to the true nature of the civilization that built the temple, remained just out of reach. As the scholars delved deeper into the secrets of the temple, a chilling possibility began to take shape in their minds. What if the knowledge of this lost civilization had not been lost by accident? What if, instead of simply vanishing from history, it had been intentionally concealed? The advanced wisdom etched into the walls of the temple, the understanding of the stars, the architecture, the cryptic symbols, was so profound that it could have altered the course of history had it fallen into the wrong hands. Could the architects of the temple have foreseen the dangers of their knowledge and taken deliberate steps to ensure that it never resurfaced? The more the scholars pieced together the fragments of history, the clearer the pattern became. The ancient civilization, it seemed, had left behind more than just physical remnants. They had embedded their wisdom in coded symbols, hidden messages, and perhaps most intriguingly, the foundations for secret societies. These societies, cloaked in mystery and built on the principles of safeguarding knowledge, were scattered across time and geography, all seemingly connected to the lost civilization in ways the world had never fully understood. Father Anselm was the first to bring up the theory. What if they knew the danger of their knowledge? What if they didn't simply disappear? They chose to hide themselves, to bury their legacy in the shadows. He had been poring over ancient texts, comparing the symbols from the temple with those found in early Freemasonic documents. And what he found was staggering. The overlap between the esoteric symbols of the temple and the cryptic iconography used by the Freemasons was undeniable. The similarities weren't just aesthetic. They were too specific, too deliberate. Had the Freemasons, whose origins were shrouded in secrecy, been the inheritors of this ancient knowledge? Isabel, equally intrigued, had spent hours researching medieval secret societies and their connections to lost knowledge. She discovered that the Freemasons, along with other orders such as the Knights Templar, had long been rumored to guard ancient secrets, secrets that were thought to be too dangerous or too powerful to be shared with the general public. The more she dug, the more it seemed that these secretive groups might have been entrusted with the protection of knowledge far older than any of them. Knowledge passed down from a civilization whose very existence had been buried by time, hidden in plain sight. The evidence suggested that these secret societies were more than just protectors of ancient wisdom. They were the custodians of a power that had the potential to reshape the world. The civilization that had built the temple, it seemed, understood the destructive potential of their wisdom. Perhaps they had foreseen that such knowledge, if misused, could lead to war, chaos, and even the collapse of civilization itself. In their desperation to protect their legacy, they had passed it down through generations, hiding it from the eyes of the masses. The cryptic symbols carved into the walls of the temple were not just a record of the past. They were the keys to a future that these architects had tried to control, even from beyond the grave. The more the scholars pondered the implications, the more they began to question everything they had ever learned about secret societies. The Freemasons, the Templars, and other shadowy groups throughout history might not have simply been guardians of arcane rituals. They might have been the keepers of a much darker secret. Had they been hiding not just knowledge, but the true legacy of the civilization that had first glimpsed the power of the stars, of the forces that governed life and death, of time itself? What was it that they had been entrusted with, and why was it so dangerous? Father Anselm's voice broke the silence. We need to ask ourselves, why was this knowledge hidden? What were they trying to protect the world from? The room fell silent. The question hung in the air. As each scholar wrestled with the enormity of what they were uncovering, if the ancient civilization had gone to such lengths to conceal their knowledge, what had they known that was so perilous? What truths had they discovered about the world, about the universe, that had led them to lock away their wisdom for eternity? As the scholars continued their investigation, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. It became increasingly clear that the lost civilization, whose wisdom had been concealed for millennia, was not merely a forgotten footnote in history. Its influence had threaded its way through time, quietly shaping some of the most pivotal events the world had ever seen. The once innocent search for answers had now evolved into something far more profound. The realization that history, as we knew it, might not be what it seemed. The cryptic symbols on the walls of the temple and the messages hidden in ancient texts had already suggested that this civilization's knowledge was too dangerous to be freely shared. But what the scholars discovered next was far more startling. This knowledge had not only been hidden, it had been deliberately guarded, nurtured, and passed down through secret societies, powerful figures, and even monarchs throughout history. The question now was, what had these secret keepers been protecting? One of the first pieces of evidence that emerged from their research pointed to the medieval knights, most notably the Knights Templar, as key players in the preservation of this ancient knowledge. The Templars, once revered as protectors of Christian pilgrims, were rumored to have guarded secret treasures, some of which were said to contain relics from the ancient world. What if those relics were not just religious artifacts, but the very keys to the lost wisdom of the forgotten civilization? The scholars' investigation into the Templars' origins and their secretive rituals revealed startling connections to the ancient symbols found in the temple. Many of the Templars' most revered rites mirrored the rituals encoded in the carvings. Was it possible that the Templars had inherited the knowledge of the lost civilization? Had they, too, understood the potential power of this wisdom? And like their predecessors, sought to control it, keeping it hidden from the world. The same patterns appeared in other secret societies, most notably the Freemasons, whose lodges were dotted across Europe. The Freemasons, known for their symbolic rituals and emphasis on hidden knowledge, seemed to carry on the Templars' legacy, albeit in a more veiled form. The evidence that these societies were tied to the ancient civilization's knowledge was undeniable. The very foundation of Freemasonry, it appeared, was built on the concealed wisdom passed down through the centuries. But why? What was so dangerous about this knowledge that it had been locked away, passed down in whispers, and guarded by powerful men throughout history? The scholars soon discovered that the secrecy surrounding this knowledge wasn't limited to the world of secret societies. It extended to kings and emperors, many of whom seemed to have access to this hidden wisdom. Take, for example, the enigmatic figure of King Solomon. The legend of his vast wisdom and his creation of the Temple of Jerusalem had always been shrouded in mystery. What if, as some historians suggested, King Solomon's wisdom was not just legendary, but rooted in the very knowledge of the lost civilization? The connection between the Templars, the Freemasons, and the ancient symbols on the temple walls seemed to suggest that the secret knowledge had made its way into the hands of European monarchs who, like the Freemasons, had sought to control it. But it didn't stop there. The scholars began to trace the influence of this hidden knowledge through wars and political upheavals. One of the most chilling realizations came when they examined the timing of some of the world's most significant conflicts. The Crusades, the 100 Years' War, the rise and fall of empires, each of these events seemed to coincide with moments when the knowledge was either rediscovered or suppressed. Could it be that wars were fought, not just over territory or religion, but over control of this ancient wisdom? The 100 Years' War, for instance, had been sparked by a dispute over succession. But what if, behind the political conflict, there was a deeper battle taking place? A battle for control of knowledge that could alter the fate of nations? What if the leaders of both sides, whether they realized it or not, were caught in a larger game? One where the true stakes were not the crown, but the knowledge that could shape the world. The same pattern emerged in the Renaissance, a period of rebirth and enlightenment. The rediscovery of ancient texts and knowledge during this time had always been attributed to the work of scholars and thinkers. But what if those ancient texts were not just rediscovered by chance? What if they had been deliberately unearthed and disseminated by a secretive group with their own agenda, ensuring that the lost wisdom of the civilization would once again influence the course of history. One of the most striking examples came from the rise of certain religious institutions during the medieval period. The Catholic Church, with its vast influence over European politics and society, had long been suspected of guarding its own set of secrets. As the scholars dug deeper into the Church's role in history, they found evidence of a delicate balance of power, one in which knowledge was kept hidden from the public, while the Church itself controlled the narrative. What if, in some cases, the Church had suppressed certain knowledge to maintain its dominance? Could it be that the architects of the lost civilization had understood the power of information, and that knowledge, when wielded by the wrong hands, could lead to chaos? As the scholars pieced together the timeline of these events, a chilling realization set in. The major events of history, the wars, the political upheavals, even the birth of new institutions, had all been influenced, if not orchestrated, by those who held the keys to this hidden knowledge. The Crusades, the rise of the Renaissance, the formation of secret societies, all of these events were part of a larger design, one that stretched across time, guiding the course of history from the shadows. The more the scholars uncovered, the more they began to question the very nature of historical records. Had the true history of the world been deliberately obscured, hidden behind a veil of conspiracy and secrecy? Had the architects of this ancient knowledge deliberately shaped the course of history, using their wisdom to guide, control, and manipulate the events of the world? As the scholars continued their investigation, a growing realization dawned upon them. The influence of the lost civilization had not merely been confined to isolated events or powerful figures from the medieval past. No, the ripples of their secret knowledge had spread far and wide, subtly shaping the course of history in ways that no one had ever truly recognized. The once fragmented puzzle pieces were beginning to fit together, and the picture they revealed was far more complex than they could have imagined. It wasn't just kings or popes who had been drawn into the web of influence cast by this hidden wisdom. The very foundations of society, institutions that had shaped the Western world for centuries, seemed to have been quietly steered by the ancient knowledge. From the earliest universities of Europe to the most revered royal families, this knowledge had seeped into the heart of civilization like a shadow, guiding thought, politics, and even the development of science and philosophy. The universities, long regarded as the bastions of intellectual freedom and the pursuit of truth, had been involved in preserving and transmitting knowledge that many believed should never have been uncovered. Were these institutions not only places of academic learning, but also covert centers where the guardians of this ancient wisdom passed down their secrets to the next generation of keepers? As the scholars dug deeper, they found unsettling evidence that the ancient civilization's influence had extended to the very power structures of Europe. The royal families, especially those of the Holy Roman Empire and France, had been connected to secretive orders that claimed to trace their origin back to the Templars, and beyond that, to the lost civilization itself. It was as if the architects of the ancient wisdom had never truly disappeared. They had simply gone underground, passing their knowledge down through clandestine channels. Whether through marriages, alliances, or covert agreements, the aristocracy seemed to have been the inheritors of this knowledge. And just like the scholars of the past, they understood the true weight of what they held. This was no mere treasure. It was the key to understanding the universe, to shaping the future of mankind. But it wasn't just the elites who had been touched by this hidden influence. The scholars began to see that the very ideas that had driven the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution had, in part, been shaped by the concealed wisdom of this lost civilization. The advancements in art, science, and philosophy that had flourished during these periods were more than just the product of genius or curiosity. They were the manifestation of a deeper, more profound understanding of the world, an understanding passed down through the centuries by those who had guarded the knowledge. The ideas of figures like Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, and even the founding fathers of America, who had been influenced by Freemasonry, now seemed to carry echoes of that long-buried wisdom. But the most troubling realization was that over time, the knowledge had been locked away. The secret keepers had become just as hidden as the knowledge itself. The question lingered in the air like an unanswered prayer. Who are the true keepers of the secrets today? The scholars began to grasp that the knowledge had not been lost. It had merely been hidden, passed down through secret societies, powerful families, and institutions that had learned to protect it from the world. And while these secret keepers had kept the knowledge in check, they had also used it to influence world events, steering the course of history from the shadows. As the scholars traced the lineage of the lost civilization's knowledge, they began to see a disturbing truth emerge. The ancient wisdom, far from being lost to time, was very much alive in the modern world. Its custodians had evolved, adapting to new eras and circumstances. But the essence of what had once been hidden in the shadows remained intact. Secret societies, cloaked in mystery, continued to protect and pass down the knowledge, shifting it from one generation to the next, each holder unaware of the full scope of its legacy. It was as if the knowledge had never really left. It had simply gone underground. The Freemasons, perhaps the most famous of these societies, stood at the forefront of this continued guardianship. Founded in the medieval period, they had long been suspected of holding on to secrets that spanned millennia. Secrets that could alter the course of human understanding. Their initiation rituals, the symbols woven into their architecture, and the cryptic texts passed between their members, all pointed toward a connection to the ancient civilization. For centuries, these societies had influenced the intellectual and political elite of Europe, embedding their teachings in the very structure of modern thought. In fact, many of the leading figures of the Enlightenment, philosophers, scientists, and statesmen, had been members, and some of the greatest minds in history had sought to unlock the ancient wisdom they believed the Freemasons possessed. But the Freemasons were not alone in guarding the secrets. The Rosicrucians, another secret society, had similarly inherited fragments of the lost knowledge. Founded in the early 17th century, their members, many of whom were alchemists, scientists, and mystics, claimed to possess esoteric wisdom passed down from ancient times. Their teachings often blended science with mysticism, reflecting a unique understanding of the world that seemed to transcend time. The Rosicrucian emphasis on spiritual enlightenment and the pursuit of hidden knowledge echoed the values of the lost civilization. It was as though these societies, both public and secret, had been holding fragments of an even greater truth, a truth that, if fully realized, could change the world. These secretive organizations had always been seen as a curious aspect of history, tucked away in the margins of popular narratives. Yet, As the scholars delved into their continued existence, a more disturbing thought began to form. What if the modern world's leaders, politicians, or intellectuals, business magnates, are unknowingly carrying the torch of an ancient secret society? The idea was unsettling. How many of today's influential figures might be unknowingly tied to these ancient teachings? Could the very people shaping the future of the world be guided, even unconsciously, by the remnants of a lost civilization's wisdom? This notion brought the scholars to an alarming conclusion. The knowledge, once hidden, was no longer just confined to secret societies. It had permeated the mainstream, influencing global events, political ideologies, and even economic systems. It was no longer a relic of the past but an active force, shaping decisions on a scale unimaginable to the average person. The technological advancements, the rising political tensions, and even the ideological movements sweeping across the globe could all trace their origins, however faintly, to the subtle influence of this ancient knowledge. It was as though the puppet strings of history were being pulled by unseen hands, pushing the world toward outcomes known only to a select few. The realization was chilling. The world, it seemed, had been shaped not by the actions of its people, but by the long-hidden knowledge passed down through these secretive organizations. What had once been a concealed legacy of the lost civilization was now alive and well in the hands of those who unknowingly carried its torch. As the scholars began to piece together the fragments of the lost civilization's knowledge, it became clear that what they had uncovered was far more than just a historical curiosity. The deeper they delved into the implications of their findings, the more it became apparent that the ancient wisdom they had unearthed was not confined to the past. It held the potential to reshape the very future of humanity. The question loomed large. What if the knowledge of this forgotten civilization could change everything we know about our world? The wisdom preserved in cryptic symbols, guarded by secret societies, and passed down through centuries was not merely about the technicalities of architecture or ancient rituals. It was about understanding the forces that shaped civilizations, societies, and the very fabric of existence itself. This knowledge seemed to transcend time and space, as though it contained universal truths about human nature, the world we inhabit, and the future that awaits us. The scholars were confronted with the profound philosophical question: what could this lost knowledge teach us about human society today? As they studied the ancient texts and analyzed the carvings on the walls of the hidden temple, they found startling parallels between the challenges the civilization had faced thousands of years ago and the issues humanity is grappling with today. In many ways, the lost civilization seemed to have anticipated the very problems modern society is now experiencing. Climate change, political instability, and the unsustainable trajectory of global development. The ancient civilization had in its wisdom understood the delicate balance required to sustain both society and the environment. There were hints in their teachings of sustainable practices, agriculture, architecture, and energy use that could hold the key to solving modern-day crises. The knowledge of how to harness natural resources without depleting them, to build societies that were both prosperous and in harmony with the environment, was embedded in their texts. The scholars began to ask, could this ancient wisdom offer the solutions we so desperately need? And then there was the political instability that had plagued humanity for centuries. Wars, revolutions, and power struggles seem to repeat themselves endlessly throughout history, with little lasting peace to show for all the bloodshed. The lost civilization's records hinted at a radically different approach to governance, one that valued balance, cooperation, and long-term thinking over short-term gain. What if the key to ending the cycles of violence that have scarred humanity for millennia was hidden in the teachings of this ancient society? Could this lost civilization offer a blueprint for a more just and equitable world? The scholar's excitement was tempered by an equally chilling realization. If this knowledge had the potential to change the world, it also carried a profound responsibility. The deeper they dug into the ancient texts, the more they realized that this wisdom was not easily understood, nor was it free from danger. What if revealing it to the world could lead to unintended consequences? What if the knowledge, in the wrong hands, could be used to manipulate or control humanity rather than liberate it? What if the ancient civilization had hidden this knowledge for a reason, not simply to protect it, but because they understood its power and the dangers it posed? This moral dilemma, the question of whether the knowledge should be shared or kept hidden, became the central focus of the scholars' investigation. They were now faced with the greatest ethical question of all. Should they reveal this powerful, world-changing knowledge to the world? Or should they protect it from those who might misuse it, just as the ancient guardians had done centuries before? The temptation to share the knowledge was strong. After all, the world was in crisis, and the wisdom of the lost civilization could provide the answers humanity so desperately needed. But the scholars also understood the risks. The knowledge was not simply a collection of facts. It was a key to understanding the very nature of power, control, and the future of the human race. Could the world handle such a revelation? Or would the consequences be catastrophic? The scholars' minds raced as they weighed the potential benefits and dangers. The knowledge could change everything. It could provide solutions to the greatest challenges humanity faces today, from climate change to inequality. It could offer a new way of thinking about the world, one based on sustainability, harmony, and the long-term welfare of all people. But at what cost? What if the wrong person or organization gained control of the knowledge? What if it became a tool of manipulation, a weapon used to cement power and control over the masses? The tension was unbearable. Every piece of evidence they uncovered seemed to pull them in two directions. On one hand, there was the overwhelming desire to share the knowledge, to let the world benefit from the wisdom of the ancients. On the other hand, there was the fear of unleashing something so powerful, so transformative, that it could disrupt the very fabric of society. The knowledge had the potential to save the world, but it also had the potential to destroy it. In the end, the scholars realized that they were not just uncovering the past, they were facing the future. The knowledge they had unearthed was not simply a relic of a long-lost civilization. It was a blueprint for the future, a map of possibilities that could either lead to a new age of enlightenment or to a catastrophic downfall. The revelation of this knowledge would not only change how humanity saw its history, it would change how we saw ourselves and our place in the world. As the last pieces of the ancient puzzle fell into place, the scholars were gripped by an overwhelming realization. They were no longer simply uncovering the past. They had uncovered something far more dangerous. An ancient knowledge so profound, so potent, that it threatened to reshape the very fabric of the world. But the question that now loomed before them was not about understanding the secrets of a forgotten civilization. It was about what they would do with this knowledge. The revelation was no longer a discovery. It was a burden. The decision weighed heavily on their shoulders. Should we share the wisdom of the ancients with the world, or is it too dangerous to expose? The stakes were higher than any of them could have imagined. The knowledge they had uncovered could be the key to solving humanity's greatest challenges: climate change, political instability, economic inequality. It offered solutions that could usher in a new era of prosperity and peace, providing the tools to build a better, more sustainable future. But as they soon realized, it came with an unimaginable price. Some of the scholars, driven by their idealism and the hope of a better world, were eager to reveal the truth. They believed that this wisdom could be the key to unlocking a golden age for humanity, an era where knowledge was no longer hoarded by the elite, but shared openly with all. They argued that humanity had suffered enough under the weight of ignorance and corruption. It was time for the world to know the truth, no matter the cost. But others, deeply aware of the chaos that might follow, were not so sure. The more they uncovered about the knowledge's true power, the more they realized that it could be used for far darker purposes. The ancient civilization had hidden this wisdom for a reason. What if, in the wrong hands, it could lead to war, manipulation, or oppression on a scale never before seen? They wondered, could humanity truly be trusted with such power? They saw the dangers of power-hungry leaders, corrupt corporations, and unscrupulous individuals who could exploit the knowledge for personal gain. What if revealing it would only tip the world into further chaos, destabilizing nations and disrupting societies that had taken centuries to build? The ethical conflict was tearing them apart. On one hand, the knowledge represented hope, the potential for a new age of enlightenment and progress. On the other, it represented a great risk, the chance that everything humanity had worked for could be undone. The scholars began to feel like they were standing on the precipice of something monumental, a decision that would shape the future of the world. Should they risk everything to share this truth, or should they bury it again, locking away the power that could either heal or destroy the world? The weight of the decision was not just academic, it was deeply personal. Each scholar wrestled with their own conscience, torn between their intellectual curiosity and the moral responsibility they felt to protect humanity from its own destructive tendencies. Some argued that to withhold the knowledge was a betrayal of human progress. Others felt that to release it would be a betrayal of humanity itself. As the days passed, the tension mounted. The decision seemed to grow more impossible with each passing hour. The question they grappled with was not just intellectual. It was deeply emotional. Could they, in good conscience, expose the world to something so dangerous? Were they prepared to face the consequences of their actions, knowing that they could never undo the damage if things went wrong? The scholars were left standing at a crossroads, unable to move forward, but knowing that a choice had to be made. And then, amid the mounting pressure, one question continued to echo in their minds. Is humanity ready for the truth? The atmosphere in the small room was thick with anticipation, the weight of history pressing down on the scholars like a physical force. Weeks of debate, endless nights spent poring over the ancient texts, and long conversations filled with doubt and fear had led them to this moment. They were at a crossroads, facing a decision that could either redeem humanity or send it spiraling into chaos. The air was heavy with the question. Should they reveal the lost knowledge to the world? The room was divided. Some of the scholars, passionate, hopeful, and deeply moved, by the promise of what this knowledge could do, argued fervently that the world was ready. They spoke of the profound truths contained within the ancient wisdom. Truths that could heal the planet, solve long-standing global issues, and offer a new path forward. Humanity deserves the chance to evolve, they argued. The world is ready for change. But others, their faces lined with the shadows of doubt, feared what might happen if the knowledge fell into the wrong hands. Thus, these scholars understood the potential for great good. But they also understood the darkness that could unfold. Could humanity handle this power? They wondered. Would the wrong people use it to manipulate, to control, to destroy? They had seen too many examples of knowledge being perverted, of history's great discoveries being twisted for selfish ends. Their concern was not just about what the knowledge could bring, but about what it might take. The debate raged on for hours, emotions running high. The scholars were torn, some filled with idealism, others with caution. In the end, there was no unanimous decision. The group had fractured. But after much deliberation, a consensus was reached, sort of. They would reveal the knowledge, but not all of it. The most dangerous and powerful secrets, they decided, would remain hidden. Only the fragments of wisdom that they believed humanity could handle would be shared. They would take a gamble, revealing just enough to inspire change, but holding back enough to safeguard against destruction. The decision felt like a victory, but also a loss. The scholars had chosen to step into the unknown, their resolve strengthening even as they knew they were playing with fire. They would give the world a glimpse of what could be, but the future was still uncertain. Would the knowledge be used for good? Or would it unleash forces beyond anyone's control? With trembling hands, they set their plans in motion. The knowledge was disseminated, first through small, controlled circles, then slowly, more widely. The internet buzzed with excitement as word of the discovery spread. Journalists, academics, politicians, and thinkers from all corners of the world began to sift through the ancient texts, the rediscovered symbols, and the philosophical insights embedded within the knowledge. Soon, the world was talking about the lost civilization. It was everywhere. The knowledge, once locked away for centuries, was now exposed to the light of day. The emotional climax of the moment was overwhelming. The scholars stood together, knowing that they had set something in motion, something they couldn't take back. The world was about to be changed, for better or worse, and they had been the ones to open the door. The relief and fear in the room were palpable, a reflection of the uncertainty that now hung over them all. There was no turning back. The final reveal echoed through the world like a ripple on a vast, restless ocean. The ancient wisdom had been shared. The scholars had made their choice. Now humanity would face the consequences, whatever they might be. The world did not react as expected. When the scholars revealed the ancient knowledge, they hoped it would spark an intellectual renaissance, a new age of enlightenment. Some envisioned a future where this wisdom would guide humanity toward peace, sustainability, and shared progress. Others, however, felt a deep sense of unease. The knowledge, once locked away for centuries, seemed too powerful to handle. And now that it was exposed, the world was forced to confront the possibility that such power was too much for any one society or any one civilization to wield responsibly. At first, the reactions were split. In academic circles, there was overwhelming excitement. with many scholars eager to dive deeper into the texts and explore the ancient civilization's discoveries. Some hailed the unveiling as the most significant intellectual breakthrough in history, a key that could unlock new technologies, philosophies, and solutions to long-standing human problems. Leaders in sustainable development spoke of using the knowledge to avert ecological disaster. Political theorists whispered that this could be the blueprint for a new world order, one where the mistakes of the past were not repeated. Yet, as the knowledge spread further into the public sphere, fears began to rise. Social media erupted with a mix of awe and anxiety. Some hailed it as a miracle, while others believed it was the beginning of the end. Rumors swirled about how this knowledge could be misused by corporations, governments, and shadowy organizations that could harness its power to manipulate the masses. And there were whispers of radical groups who believed that the ancient wisdom contained the keys to overthrowing the current world order. They saw it not as a gift, but as a weapon. Would those in power use it to cement their dominance over the people? Would the knowledge be twisted and abused in ways that could lead to a new age of oppression? The scholars themselves were left in a state of deep reflection. They watched, helpless, as the world reacted, unpredictably and with growing tension. Did they do the right thing? Was revealing the knowledge a gift or a curse? The hope they once held, that this wisdom would heal the world, began to feel fragile, almost naive. They knew, deep down, that there was no going back. The world had been exposed to a truth it may not be ready for. The balance between enlightenment and chaos had always been delicate, and now the world seemed to teeter dangerously on the edge. The real twist, however, came when the scholars were contacted by a mysterious group, one that had been quietly following their progress from the shadows. They had assumed this group was merely another faction interested in the knowledge, another group of intellectuals perhaps. But when the message came through, it was clear that these people were something much more than they had anticipated. The group claimed to be the true descendants of the ancient civilization, its rightful heirs, who had been watching, waiting, and most importantly, protecting their legacy for millennia. They explained that the scholars' discovery, while impressive, was incomplete. In fact, much of the knowledge the scholars had unveiled had been intentionally withheld by the civilization's true descendants, who had safeguarded it for reasons of their own. This revelation sent shockwaves through the scholarly community and left the public reeling. Had the scholars been pawns in a much larger game? Had they unknowingly handed the world a half-truth, a dangerous fragment of a much greater puzzle? The true descendants claimed that the knowledge revealed to the world was only the surface, just a fraction of what had been passed down through secret channels for centuries. The scholars struggled to process this new information. If the descendants of the lost civilization had been guarding the knowledge for so long, why now? Why allow the world to believe that the secrets had been unlocked, only to reveal that the full extent of the knowledge had yet to be seen? The group explained that the time for secrecy had ended. Something was coming, something that would change everything. They were not just passive observers. They had their own plans for the future, ones that would now begin to unfold. This revelation opened up a flood of questions, leaving the scholars and the audience wondering, what else had the scholars missed? Who were these true descendants, and what was their role in the history of the lost civilization? The implication was clear. the knowledge shared with the world was merely a prelude. The full story, the true story, had yet to be told. As the final pieces of the puzzle began to take shape, the audience was left with more questions than answers. The world had been changed, yes, but not in the way the scholars had expected. The knowledge was no longer just an academic pursuit. It had become a force with the potential to reshape the very fabric of reality. Whether for good or ill, the revelation had ignited something unstoppable. And so, the scholars found themselves at the center of a new mystery, one that had only just begun. The doors they had opened were not just portals to the past, but to the future. As they watched the world react to their decision, they understood that their work was far from over. The knowledge, though revealed, was not complete. The true heirs of the lost civilization had just shown their cards, and with that revelation, the future of humanity hung in the balance. As the knowledge of the lost civilization continues to seep into the public consciousness, a quiet revolution begins to unfold within academic circles. The scholars who first unearthed the secrets now find themselves standing at the precipice of a monumental shift, a paradigm that challenges the very foundation of recorded history. What had once been accepted as historical fact is now under scrutiny, as the new discoveries demand a re-evaluation of everything we thought we knew about the past. For centuries, history has been shaped by a select few narratives, written by those in power, often with gaps, omissions, and biases built into the record. The medieval period, with its wars, kings, and rise of the Catholic Church, had long been seen as a turning point for Western civilization. Yet, with the emergence of this new knowledge, these seemingly unshakable truths are being called into question. The lost civilization, which once seemed like little more than myth, now holds the key to unlocking a far broader and more complex story. As scholars pore over the newly decoded manuscripts and carvings, they begin to see connections between the lost civilization and ancient cultures thought to have been isolated. The Egyptians, with their intricate knowledge of architecture and astronomy, suddenly appear less mysterious when compared to the advanced techniques of the lost civilization. The Persians, known for their early empire building, show striking similarities to the unknown civilization in terms of social structure and technological achievements. Even the Indus Valley, whose script has long remained indecipherable, begins to make more sense when viewed through the lens of this new knowledge. This historical revisionism is both exhilarating and unsettling. The past is being rewritten in real time as more and more evidence comes to light. What once seemed like separate and isolated civilizations now appear to have shared a deeper common ancestry, one that could have shaped the course of human history in ways that challenged the very idea of human progress. The suggestion that humanity's early civilizations were not isolated, but connected by a shared pool of ancient wisdom, shifts our understanding of the origins of agriculture, writing, and even urbanization. Yet, as exciting as this new perspective is, it also comes with a sense of unease. If these revelations are correct, then much of what we have been taught about history, the rise of empires, the development of cultures, even the idea of the Dark Ages following the fall of Rome, may be based on incomplete or deliberately skewed narratives. The newly uncovered knowledge forces us to confront a difficult question. How much of what we have believed is simply the result of historical blind spots or intentional erasure? For the audience, this section offers a thrilling yet disorienting experience. History, A seemingly solid edifice, built on centuries of scholarship, begins to crumble before their eyes. The implications are enormous. What if the history we've inherited has been wrong all along? What if the real story of humanity is far more complex, far older than anyone ever realized? This is the essence of historical revisionism, where new facts and perspectives emerge to disrupt old certainties. As the narrative unfolds, the audience is encouraged to look critically at their own understanding of history. The idea that history is not a fixed truth, but a constantly evolving narrative, subject to reinterpretation in light of new discoveries, adds a layer of intrigue and mystery. In the next section, we will delve deeper into the institutional pushback, how established powers, both academic and religious, are grappling with the implications of this new knowledge and seeking to protect their long-held truths. The clash between old and new knowledge is imminent. When the ancient knowledge of the lost civilization came to light, it was not only a revelation of forgotten history, it was a direct challenge to the very heart of religious doctrine, particularly the teachings of the Church. For centuries, the Church had been the supreme arbiter of truth, shaping narratives about creation, the origins of humanity, and the very nature of existence itself. The discovery of this knowledge, with its implications for the understanding of ancient civilizations, threatened to unravel centuries of carefully constructed authority. The tension was immediate. For those within the Church's hierarchy, the newfound wisdom represented more than just a historical discovery. It was an existential threat to the Church's claim as the sole keeper of spiritual and moral truth. The implications were profound. The knowledge revealed an ancient society with technologies, philosophies, and understanding that predated much of the accepted timeline of human history. This not only contradicted biblical narratives, but also posed a challenge to the Church's ability to maintain control over the spiritual and intellectual realms. If such knowledge existed and was accessible to the public, it could undermine centuries of teachings, leading people to question not just the facts of history, but the very nature of their faith. The battle lines were drawn quickly. On one side stood the scholars, those who, driven by intellectual curiosity and a desire for truth, saw this discovery as a way to rewrite history, embrace new knowledge, and ultimately advance human understanding. On the other side, the Church and its defenders pushed back hard, determined to preserve the worldview they had upheld for centuries. This was no small matter of academia or philosophy. The very authority of the Church was at stake. If this knowledge were accepted as legitimate, it would not only rewrite history, it would challenge the divine order that had been the cornerstone of faith for millennia. Behind the scenes, efforts to suppress the revelations began. Certain factions within the Church attempted to discredit the scholars' findings, labeling them as heretical or a fabrication. Media outlets sympathetic to the Church's interests were quick to stoke fear and doubt, suggesting that the knowledge was dangerous, that it was the work of secret societies or occultists bent on reshaping society for their own purposes. The whispers of a hidden agenda grew louder, as some even accused the scholars of engaging in a conspiracy to undermine religion itself. In contrast, there were those within the Church who sought to accommodate the revelations, trying to present them in a way that would not disrupt the foundations of faith. They argued that the lost civilization's knowledge, if understood properly, could be seen as complementary to religious teachings, not contradictory. But this was a fragile compromise, and it did little to quell the growing sense of unease within the institution. Some of the more conservative elements feared that even this concession would lead to an irreversible erosion of the Church's power and influence. The conflict between preserving the traditional worldview and embracing the new revelations ignited fierce debates in both theological and academic circles. Some of the most passionate defenders of the status quo claimed that the rediscovered knowledge was too dangerous to be exposed in its entirety, suggesting that humanity was not yet ready to handle the truth. The notion of revealing such knowledge was branded as an existential threat, not just to the Church, but to society at large. After all, what would happen to faith if humanity were to learn that there were truths hidden for centuries, truths that could potentially render established beliefs obsolete? For the scholars, this resistance became a dangerous game. As they pushed forward with their work, the pressure mounted. Those who continued to advocate for the public sharing of the knowledge found themselves increasingly isolated, threatened not only by academic critics, but by those in power who saw the revelations as a challenge to their authority. Some began to speak of the dangers of truth, a cryptic phrase that suggested the information, while invaluable, might be best left buried. This ideological clash between the Church and the scholars marked the beginning of a much broader struggle. The question of whether humanity was ready to confront these truths was not just an intellectual debate. It was a battle for control over the past, the present, and the future of belief itself. As the resistance from the Church intensified, the scholars found themselves retreating into more secretive channels, forced to navigate the murky waters of institutional resistance. The stakes were growing higher, and the pressure to protect their findings, or suppress them, became a matter of life and death for some. The stage was set. The scholars were no longer just unraveling the mysteries of a lost civilization. They were at the center of a struggle that had implications far beyond the academic realm. The next phase of the story would not only involve more resistance from powerful religious institutions, but it would also reveal the wider geopolitical impact this knowledge would have on the world stage. The discovery of the lost civilization's knowledge was far from an academic exercise. It was a catalyst, an ignition point that reverberated across the globe in ways no one had predicted. What began as a quest for understanding quickly escalated into a high-stakes geopolitical battle. One where governments, shadowy organizations, and powerful elites all saw an opportunity to manipulate the newfound wisdom for their own agendas. At first, the reaction from the world's political powers was cautious, curiosity with a sense of disbelief. But soon, the implications of the discovery began to sink in. The knowledge was more than just an academic treasure. It was the key to technologies and philosophies that could revolutionize society. Ancient scientific insights, lost engineering principles, and unorthodox political theories, these were the pieces of the puzzle now on the table. To the world's most powerful players, this was not just a historical curiosity. It was a means to reshape the future. Some governments, especially those in the West, saw the potential to harness this knowledge for technological advancement. If they could unlock the lost civilization's secrets, its methods for energy, medicine, or engineering, they could leap ahead of their global rivals. In this race for supremacy, there was no room for hesitation. Those who controlled the knowledge would control the future. Behind closed doors, intelligence agencies and national security agencies scrambled to assess the threat. The information had the potential to shift the balance of power. Intelligence operatives were dispatched to track down scholars and gain access to their research. Meanwhile, powerful military and economic interests began to realize that the knowledge contained within the lost civilization's teachings could bolster national security or grant their economies an insurmountable advantage. The competition, however, was not limited to governments. Secret societies, whose very existence had long been suspected but never fully confirmed, began to emerge from the shadows. Ancient organizations like the Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and others with veiled histories suddenly found themselves playing a central role in the drama. It became clear that these groups had been aware of the ancient wisdom long before it reached this public. Some had been guarding it for centuries, passing it down in secret. Others saw it as an opportunity to advance their own global ambitions. As this global intrigue intensified, the stakes grew higher and the game became more ruthless. The scholars, who had once been driven by the pure pursuit of knowledge, found themselves thrust into a world of espionage and danger. Their discoveries, once protected in academic journals and private archives, were now commodities sought by every major power on Earth. They were no longer just historians or linguists. They had become pawns in a high-stakes game of international chess. Scholars who had once shared their findings freely began to receive ominous threats. One by one, key researchers vanished, their work stolen, their personal lives threatened. Some were found dead under mysterious circumstances, their deaths ruled as accidents or suicides, but rumors of foul play swirled behind closed doors. The geopolitical consequences of the lost knowledge were beginning to unfold. Power struggles played out not only on the global stage, but within national borders. Countries that had once been allies now found themselves in bitter competition, with espionage operations and covert missions becoming commonplace. There were reports of political assassinations aimed at those who stood in the way of certain factions gaining control of the information. Governments feared the knowledge would empower their enemies, while at the same time secret organizations plotted to keep the knowledge contained, believing that only a select few could be trusted with such power. The scholars, once naive in their belief that the discovery of a lost civilization would simply alter history, now found themselves tangled in a web of global politics. It wasn't just their lives at risk, it was the very future of the world order. As the competition for control escalated, alliances formed and crumbled. Betrayals took place in the dark, and people were drawn into a deadly game they never anticipated. A series of leaks exposed that multiple governments had already begun incorporating the newly discovered knowledge into their military projects. Researchers in private laboratories were rumored to be experimenting with ancient methods of energy generation, potentially rewriting the rules of physics itself. Meanwhile, some radical factions, claiming that the knowledge was a divine gift, began to make public declarations about the coming of a new world order, one that would be led by those who had access to the ancient wisdom. The most disturbing development came when a covert organization, who had once been believed to be merely a conspiracy theory, made their move. They revealed themselves to the scholars in a chilling encounter. This group, whose members were drawn from a long lineage of scholars, secret rulers, and influencers, claimed that they were the true descendants of the lost civilization. They had been safeguarding the knowledge for centuries, awaiting the right moment to reveal it to the world. The revelation sent shockwaves through the academic community, with many now wondering if the entire discovery had been orchestrated from the start. if the scholars were merely pawns in a game that had been played for centuries. The knowledge that once seemed like a blessing now appeared as a double-edged sword. It held the power to uplift humanity, if used correctly, but it also had the potential to tear society apart. With the control of this knowledge now in the hands of powerful, secretive factions, the world stood on the precipice of an uncertain future. Would humanity rise to the occasion using the wisdom of the lost civilization to unite and heal the world? Or would it fall into chaos, as those who controlled the knowledge played a dangerous game for power? The scholars, who had once believed they were uncovering a forgotten chapter of history, now realized they had unwittingly opened Pandora's box. The ancient knowledge they had unearthed was far more potent than they had ever imagined, and it was no longer a question of what it could reveal about the past, but what it could do to the future. As global powers aligned and contended for control, the scholars were left to wonder, had they started something that was destined to spiral beyond their control? Was the world truly ready to confront the power of a civilization that had once shaped the course of human history and might now be shaping it again? The answer to that question, of course, remained uncertain. But what was clear was that the world would never be the same again. The discovery had set in motion a chain of events that could reshape the very foundations of modern civilization. And as the competition for control over the lost knowledge grew fiercer, the fate of the world seemed to hang in the balance. The moment the scholars released their findings to the public, the world was thrust into a new era. After months of secretive research, guarded revelations, and covert operations, the truth about the lost civilization, its advanced knowledge, its mysterious influence on history, and its profound secrets was finally made available to all. What had once been confined to dusty academic journals and private discussions was now a global phenomenon. The reaction was swift, intense, and completely unpredictable. News outlets across the globe scrambled to cover the groundbreaking revelation. Journalists and reporters, their heads spinning with the magnitude of the discovery, flooded the airwaves and digital platforms with commentary and analysis. Social media erupted into chaos, with every corner of the globe echoing with reactions. Hashtags like #LostCivilization, #Ancient Wisdom, and Shattered History began trending within hours. The debates that followed were as polarized as they were passionate. On one side, there were those who embraced the revelation as a beacon of hope, a golden opportunity for humanity to evolve beyond its current limitations. For them, the lost civilization represented a forgotten path forward, one that could guide the world into an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity. They viewed the discovery as the ultimate breakthrough, one that could provide solutions to humanity's most pressing issues: climate change, political instability, inequality, and social unrest. They believed that unlocking the ancient knowledge would usher in a new age of scientific, technological, and spiritual enlightenment. But for others, the revelation sparked fear and resistance. Skeptics and critics, particularly among conservative factions, feared that the knowledge represented a dangerous destabilization of the world order. They saw the secrets of the lost civilization as a threat to the established power structures, institutions, and ideologies that had shaped society for centuries. The very fabric of human history was now in question, and with it, the foundations of religion, politics, and culture. Could the old systems of governance, faith, and education survive this seismic shift? Or was the revelation an existential threat to the established order? Protests began to erupt in cities around the world, fueled by widespread anxiety. Some were peaceful, with individuals holding signs demanding transparency, while others quickly turned into violent uprisings. People clashed in the streets, torn between a desire to embrace the new knowledge and the fear that it would bring about chaos and societal collapse. Long-standing institutions, governments, religious organizations, academic institutions found themselves scrambling to respond, trying to control the narrative and mitigate the growing unrest. In the midst of the turmoil, the scholars, once celebrated as heroes, found themselves at the center of the storm. They had uncovered a secret that threatened to unravel everything. Their lives, which had once been defined by curiosity and scholarly ambition, were now overshadowed by the weight of their discovery. Some of the scholars were hailed as visionaries, brave enough to expose the truth to the world, while others were vilified as reckless, accused of unleashing a force they could not fully comprehend. The media, once eager to laud their work, now turned on them, amplifying every mistake, every misstep, every controversy. The truth, once hidden in the shadows of history, had come into the light. And in that light, humanity was forced to confront the most fundamental questions about its past, its future, and its place in the universe. No one knew exactly where this revelation would lead, but one thing was certain: the world had changed forever. The public awakening had begun. Some saw it as the dawn of a new era, while others viewed it as the beginning of the end. The true consequences of the revelation were still unknown, but the scholars, the media, and the world at large were about to learn just how far-reaching this discovery would be. The knowledge was out, and nothing would ever be the same again. As the world begins to process the revelation of the lost civilization's knowledge, something deeper begins to unfold. It's not just society's structures that are in turmoil. Humanity itself is undergoing a profound shift in consciousness. The very core of how people view themselves, their place in the world, and their understanding of existence is being altered in ways that cannot be easily undone. Philosophers, spiritual leaders, and ordinary individuals alike are grappling with questions that they never thought to ask before. Some find themselves drawn to the ancient wisdom, seeing it as a beacon of hope. For the first time in their lives, they feel that the answers to life's most pressing questions about meaning, purpose, and even the mysteries of the universe are within reach. This knowledge, once hidden for millennia, seems to offer a new path for humanity, a path toward enlightenment, sustainability, and harmony. For those who embrace it, it becomes a guide to personal growth and collective evolution. They begin to apply the lost civilization's principles to their everyday lives, some in quiet, personal reflections, others in more radical social movements calling for a global awakening. But for others, the knowledge is a threat, one so disruptive that it threatens everything they've built their lives upon. In churches, universities, and government offices, there are murmurs of fear. For centuries, people have relied on established beliefs, systems, and structures to navigate the world. The sudden disruption caused by the revelation shakes the very foundations of these institutions. Many see the ancient wisdom as an unwelcome invader, one that challenges long-held truths, including faith, history, and morality. The loss of control over such powerful knowledge is an existential threat, and those who have spent their lives safeguarding the old ways begin to cling to them more fiercely. struggling to preserve what little stability they feel is left. The scholars themselves are not immune to this shift. Once driven purely by intellectual curiosity, they now find themselves at the center of a personal transformation. As the weight of their discovery presses down on them, they question the consequences of their actions. What had they hoped to achieve by sharing this knowledge? Did they truly understand the potential ramifications? Or had they been naive in believing that humanity was ready for such a revelation? Some of them feel the growing burden of their choice, wondering if they had unleashed something that is now impossible to contain. Others, however, are resolute in their belief that the truth must be known, no matter the cost. But even they can't escape the quiet voices of doubt creeping into their minds. As time passes, society as a whole begins to experience the shift. People from all walks of life, farmers, teachers, activists, corporate leaders, begin to question their old assumptions. The revelation has become a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest desires, fears, and aspirations. It forces individuals to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves, their cultures, and their societies. What had once seemed certain, identity, purpose, even the very nature of reality, now feels fluid, uncertain, and open to reinterpretation. As the world's collective consciousness shifts, people start to ask questions that echo across centuries. Who are we, really? Where do we come from? What is our place in the vastness of time? And most hauntingly, where do we go from here? This shift is not just philosophical. It's existential. It's as if a veil has been lifted from humanity's collective psyche. The questions now at the forefront are not merely about power, politics, or religion. They are about truth itself, and whether we, as a species, are ready to bear its weight. The global response to the revelation of the lost civilization's knowledge is nothing short of tumultuous. In the early days following the scholar's public disclosure, the world seems paralyzed by confusion, fear, and awe. Governments, religious organizations, academic institutions, and private interests scramble to comprehend, contain, or exploit the ancient wisdom. Yet, for all the excitement and debate, many are unprepared for the scale and depth of the change this revelation has set into motion. At first, many governments move swiftly to suppress the findings. Leaders, already on edge due to rising political instability and economic uncertainty, view the new knowledge as a direct threat to their power. The truth is too potent, too disruptive, to be allowed to spread unchecked. Secretive meetings are held behind closed doors, where intelligence agencies and military forces are enlisted to track and control the dissemination of the information. In some countries, attempts to censor or dismiss the discoveries are made in the name of national security. The ruling powers, fearing the unraveling of the status quo, are determined to control the narrative, if not outright bury the knowledge. Yet, despite these efforts, the public response grows stronger by the day. In academic circles, fierce debates erupt. While some scholars dismiss the new revelations as mere speculation or manipulation, others see it as the breakthrough of a lifetime, a chance to fundamentally redefine the course of human history. Universities and think tanks begin to dissect the ancient teachings, exploring their possible applications to modern science, technology, and philosophy. New theories about the lost civilization's achievements start to emerge, challenging previously accepted timelines and rewriting the foundations of human progress. These intellectual movements, however, don't come without their own controversies. For some, the new knowledge feels like a Pandora's box that should have never been opened, and the more traditional academic powers rally against the new wave of intellectual exploration. Meanwhile, in the religious world, the reaction is divided and often explosive. Many of the world's major religions find their teachings directly challenged by the ancient wisdom now in the public domain. Clergy from various faiths struggle to reconcile their dogma with the ideas now circulating. Ideas about a forgotten past, a civilization that predated all known religions and seemed to possess knowledge far more advanced than any scripture had ever suggested. For some religious leaders, this knowledge threatens the very core of their faith. In response, many begin to issue stern warnings, declaring the ancient wisdom to be heretical or dangerous, even going so far as to excommunicate those who advocate for embracing it. But there's another reaction. Some religious and spiritual groups, intrigued by the deep philosophical implications of the newfound knowledge, begin to integrate it into their own teachings. Theologians and mystics interpret the lost wisdom as a divine revelation, one that will guide humanity toward a more enlightened, harmonious existence. They claim that the teachings are not in opposition to faith, but in complement with it, a chance for a spiritual rebirth that aligns ancient truths with modern understanding. In churches, temples, and spiritual communities around the world, prayers and meditations begin to reflect this new synthesis of thought, and a movement begins to form around the promise of a new age of spiritual enlightenment. On the opposite side, those who are threatened by the loss of control begin to conspire to stop the rise of this movement. Powerful figures, long accustomed to manipulating the flow of information for their own agendas, begin to form alliances with private entities and shadow organizations to suppress the rise of this new thinking. Corporate interests, too, see an opportunity. Some wish to control the knowledge for their own profit, hoping to use it to leap ahead in technology and business. Others, particularly those who see the potential for the knowledge to disrupt global markets, attempt to undermine it by casting doubt on its authenticity or usefulness. In the shadows, clandestine operations are launched to discredit the scholars and stop the movement before it can gain momentum. Amidst all of this chaos, something surprising begins to take shape. A global movement, led by ordinary people, begins to form. Citizens, activists, and philosophers unite around the idea of a revolution in human thinking. These individuals, often dismissed as fringe thinkers before the revelation, now find themselves at the forefront of a worldwide push to integrate the ancient knowledge into all aspects of modern life. They rally for a radical rethinking of ethics, society, and governance, advocating for a future that is sustainable, interconnected, and based on the principles of the lost civilization. The movement grows, quickly spreading across social media platforms, forums, and global protests, with millions rallying behind the banner of a new era. This public awakening comes with its own challenges, of course. The movement is fragmented, with competing factions pushing different interpretations of the ancient wisdom. Some call for radical change, pushing for immediate political and social upheaval. Others advocate for a slower, more deliberate process of integration, urging caution and thoughtfulness. But despite these differences, the underlying message is clear. Humanity is on the verge of a new chapter, one that could fundamentally change the course of history. At the same time, the scholars who uncovered the knowledge find themselves at the center of an emotional and intellectual maelstrom. They watch as the world reacts to their discovery with a mixture of admiration, fear, and admiration tinged with anxiety. For many of them, the pressure is overwhelming. Some begin to question whether they made the right decision in revealing the knowledge, while others grapple with the responsibility that comes with being the catalysts for such a profound global shift. As the implications of their discovery play out on the world stage, the scholars realize that they are no longer mere academics. They are now at the helm of a movement that could either guide humanity to a new era or lead it to ruin. In a dramatic final twist, a mysterious figure steps forward. A leader from a shadowy, powerful organization that had been watching the scholars' work in secret. This leader claims to be the true heir of the lost civilization, a direct descendant of its people, and offers to help the world unlock the full potential of the ancient knowledge. With calm confidence, they explain that there are yet deeper, more profound secrets buried within the teachings that could reshape not just society, but the very fabric of reality itself. But there's a catch. This knowledge, powerful as it may be, comes with risks that could challenge the very nature of what it means to be human. The leader warns that humanity is not yet ready to fully understand or wield this knowledge, and they must decide whether to proceed carefully or with reckless abandon. As the ancient knowledge spread, it took root in unexpected places, igniting a quiet storm of ideas that rippled across the globe. What began as a quiet discovery made by scholars in the dim light of libraries and dusty archives had now evolved into a global awakening. The teachings of a lost civilization, once locked away in forgotten manuscripts, were beginning to shape a new world. But what kind of world would it be? Movements began to emerge, some small and quiet, others loud and forceful, all drawing inspiration from the lost wisdom. Philosophers, spiritual leaders, and scientists found themselves re-examining the world through a new lens, one shaped by a civilization that had lived in harmony with nature and had unlocked secrets about the human mind and the universe itself. It was as if humanity, having stumbled upon an ancient Mamzas, was now trying to navigate a future they hadn't quite anticipated. Some saw the wisdom as a return to simplicity. These thinkers believed that humanity had lost its way, lost its connection to the earth and each other in its relentless pursuit of progress. They advocated for a return to a simpler, more sustainable way of life, one that embraced the balance the lost civilization had once known. Cities might be redesigned to blend with nature, technology used to restore the environment rather than exploit it, and communities could once again live in harmony with the earth rather than against it. These ideas began to spread, especially among those disillusioned by the chaos of the modern world. There was talk of slowing down, reconnecting with the basics of life, family, nature, community. To some, this was the true revolution. But not everyone shared this vision. Others saw the ancient knowledge as a call to transcend the limitations of the human experience. They believed that humanity could evolve beyond its current state, using the ancient teachings as a blueprint to accelerate progress, break the boundaries of the physical world, and reshape the future. With advancements in technology, medicine, and science, humanity could use this knowledge to solve problems once thought insurmountable. Disease, climate change, inequality. They imagined a world where humanity had reached its ultimate potential, free from the constraints of the past. But this path was fraught with danger. Some feared that such advancements could come at a high cost. Technologies too powerful, ideologies too extreme, and leaders too ambitious. Could humanity, in its thirst for progress, risk losing its humanity? And so the world divided. One camp envisioned a return to the past, the other an ascent into a bold, uncharted future. Both sides believed they had the wisdom of the ancients on their side, but neither could agree on how it should be applied. The scholars who had once been silent discoverers now found themselves at the center of a storm they never intended to create. They had unearthed the past, but it was the future that seemed most uncertain. In every corner of the globe, people were starting to ask themselves, what kind of world do we want to build with this knowledge? The ancient wisdom, or once a quiet whisper in the shadows of history, was now a loud, insistent call to action. And with every answer came another question. As the revolution of ideas continued to unfold, the next phase of this awakening would not be found in boardrooms or political debates. It would be found in the hearts and minds of ordinary people. What did this new world mean for them? Would they rise to the challenge, or would they be swept up in the tides of change, helpless to shape their own destiny? The seeds of revolution had been planted, but how would they grow? Would they bring about a new age of enlightenment? Or would they lead to a world even more fractured than before? The answers lay ahead, waiting to be discovered, as the revolution continued to unfold. Not just in the halls of power, but in the very lives of everyday people. The ancient knowledge had swept across the world, not just changing societies or systems, but deep inside the hearts and minds of ordinary people. It was as though a veil had been lifted, revealing possibilities that were once thought to be unattainable. For many, it felt as if they were waking from a long slumber, seeing the world for the first time. The truths unveiled by the lost civilization awakened something primal in them, an innate understanding that humanity was capable of far more than they had ever believed. But this awakening was not without its costs. For some, the truth proved too overwhelming. Their lives, built on familiar routines and beliefs, began to unravel. It wasn't just the facts of the ancient knowledge that shook them. It was the weight of everything that now seemed false in comparison. The constructs they had relied on, society's expectations, personal goals, even the basic structure of their day-to-day lives, began to feel like illusions. Could they have been living a lie all along? Some wrestled with existential crises, their minds grappling with the enormity of it all. How could they continue in a world where everything they thought was true had been turned upside down? It was as if they had been handed a mirror, and the reflection staring back at them was a version of reality they no longer recognized. The old world, with its limitations and constraints, no longer seemed sufficient. These people felt both lost and liberated at once, caught between the desire to embrace the new knowledge and the fear of what that might mean for their lives. Their old identities crumbled, and in the silence of their uncertainty, they were forced to face a new question. Who are we, now that we know what we never knew before? But not everyone reacted with fear. For others, the knowledge was a beacon of hope, a sign that humanity could transcend its current state, could become more than it had ever been. The ancient wisdom didn't just promise a new way of living. It suggested that the human spirit was capable of extraordinary things. Inspired by the possibilities, many embarked on personal journeys of growth and transformation. They dedicated themselves to advancing the knowledge, not just for their own benefit, but for the collective good. There was a profound sense of purpose in their actions, one that transcended individual gain. These individuals sought to solve the world's most pressing issues: poverty, climate change, inequality, problems once thought insurmountable. The wisdom of the ancients offered solutions, both practical and philosophical, and it was up to them to bring those solutions to life. This new wave of personal growth wasn't without its challenges either. As the individuals transformed, so did their relationships. Family dynamics shifted as old values were questioned and new ones were adopted. Friends who had once been close found themselves drifting apart, unable to understand the new path that their peers had chosen. Communities, too, felt the strain as differing ideologies began to clash. Some embraced the change, eager to step into a new era. Others resisted it, unable or unwilling to accept the implications of what had been revealed. The tension between hope and fear rippled through these personal connections, creating rifts, but also new bonds. The world was shifting, and it was impossible to stay the same. For many, this was a time of profound transformation. But in the midst of these personal awakenings, a larger question began to emerge. As more individuals began to embrace this new worldview, what would it mean for society at large? How would governments, corporations, and institutions respond to the wave of change that was sweeping through their people? Would they try to suppress the knowledge, or would they harness its power for their own ends? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. As individuals navigated their own transformations, the world seemed to be on the precipice of something even larger. Would humanity rise to its potential, or would it collapse under the weight of its own ambition? The next stage of the journey was about to unfold, and the answers would lie not in the wisdom itself, but in how the world would choose to use it. As the knowledge of the lost civilizations spread across the globe, its transformative power ignited more than just individual awakenings. It stirred the very foundations of world order. What had once been a quiet discovery among scholars now threatened to reshape the political, economic, and cultural landscape. Governments, corporations, and shadowy organizations were no longer passive observers. They had become active participants in the fight for control over this newfound power. Some governments, sensing an opportunity for renewal, began to integrate the ancient wisdom into their policies. The allure of harmonizing human progress with nature, as the ancient teachings suggested, was irresistible. Countries that embraced this new knowledge set ambitious goals for sustainability, social equity, and technological advancement. Cities were redesigned with nature in mind, industries transformed to reduce environmental impact, and entire political systems were restructured to reflect the teachings of a civilization long lost, told to history. Leaders spoke passionately about the lessons from the past, lessons they believed would guide humanity away from the mistakes that had led to wars, environmental degradation, and social inequality. These leaders presented themselves as the architects of a new world, one that could prevent the collapse of civilization that had befallen so many ancient societies before. But not all governments shared this optimism. Some, particularly those that had long held power through authoritarian means, saw the ancient knowledge as a threat. The knowledge of the lost civilization had the potential to challenge their control over society, erode their grip on power, and disrupt the status quo. Fearing that the spread of this wisdom could lead to uprisings or revolutions, They moved quickly to suppress it. Intellectuals, activists, and even journalists who advocated for the public dissemination of the knowledge were silenced, sometimes through censorship, sometimes through more extreme measures. Scholars who dared to speak openly about the ancient teachings found themselves imprisoned or worse, accused of treason or sedition. The authorities claimed that the knowledge was too dangerous to be shared with the masses, that it could destabilize governments and plunge the world into chaos. In parallel, powerful corporations began to see the potential in the ancient knowledge, not as a tool for global good, but as a commodity. For them, it was about control. Control over the future of energy, technology, and even human consciousness. Some corporations attempted to harness the teachings for innovation, promising breakthroughs in renewable energy, artificial intelligence, and genetic engineering. But beneath their promises of a utopian future lay darker motives. These companies didn't just want to improve the world. They wanted to dominate it. They envisioned monopolizing the very knowledge that had been uncovered, using it to corner markets, manipulate economies, and secure their place as the gatekeepers of the future. In a world already rife with corporate greed, the consequences of this type of exploitation were chilling. And then there were the shadows. A secretive group, one that had remained hidden for centuries, began to reveal itself. They claimed to be the descendants of the lost civilization, the true keepers of its wisdom. For generations, they had quietly observed history unfold, waiting for the right moment to reveal their presence. Now, that moment had arrived. They were not simply interested in preserving the knowledge, they intended to control it. The members of this group saw themselves as the rightful stewards of the ancient teachings, believing that their bloodline had been entrusted with the responsibility of guiding humanity to its greatest potential. They had no intention of sharing the knowledge freely. Instead, they sought to manipulate it, ensuring that only those deemed worthy, or those who aligned with their ideals, would be allowed access. In their hands, the knowledge of the past became not a tool for enlightenment, but a weapon to reshape the world according to their vision. The global stage was now set for a battle of ideologies. On one side, you had governments that sought to use the knowledge for the betterment of all, seeking harmony and balance. On the other, there were those who feared the loss of control and attempted to suppress it through violence and censorship. Meanwhile, corporations saw a golden opportunity to profit from humanity's newfound understanding, while the shadowy group, with its secret agenda, worked behind closed doors to shape the future in ways unknown to the public. This tug of war for control over the knowledge brought a new urgency to the world's political and economic systems. Trust in institutions, governments, corporations, even the media, began to erode as people realized that the true stakes were not just about policies, but about the very direction humanity was heading. Was this ancient wisdom a path to salvation? Or was it a Pandora's box that could unravel the fabric of society? The battle lines were drawn, and no one could predict how this struggle would unfold. But one thing was clear. The power of the ancient knowledge was far too great to remain in the hands of a few. The future of humanity now hinged on a dangerous game, one where the forces of control would clash with those of liberation. And the outcome would decide whether the world would embrace this new era of enlightenment or spiral into chaos. As the conflict unfolded, the world held its breath, unsure whether this new knowledge would heal the wounds of history or repeat the mistakes of the past. and with every passing day, the stakes grew higher. Would the knowledge be used to unite or divide? Would it empower the people, or be wielded as a weapon for the powerful few? The stage was set, and humanity's future was in the balance. The question that remained: who would hold the keys to the past and to the future? The world had been waiting for this moment. An intense, suffocating silence had fallen over the gathering. In a grand, stark conference hall, representatives from the world's most powerful governments, intellectuals, secret societies, and those few brave scholars who had uncovered the long-lost knowledge of the ancient civilization had come together. The stakes? Nothing less than the future of humanity itself. What to do with the knowledge that had the power to reshape history, to elevate mankind, or to destroy it? The scholars who had spent years piecing together fragments of this forgotten past now found themselves at the center of a storm, thrust into a position they could never have imagined. They had once believed their task was simple: to uncover the truths buried beneath layers of time. But as the room filled with hushed voices, the weight of their discovery loomed over them, heavier than they had ever anticipated. They were no longer mere researchers. They were custodians of a truth that could no longer be ignored. Some of the world's most influential figures had gathered to debate. Among them were those who believed that the knowledge, no matter how dangerous, must be laid bare for all to see. They argued that humanity could no longer live in the shadows, clinging to outdated, incomplete versions of history. The truth, they insisted, must be known, no matter the cost. Only then could mankind begin to evolve, to truly understand its origins and reach for a future beyond its limitations. They spoke of transparency, of progress, of a world where the shackles of ignorance could be cast off. Yet, in the shadows of the room, other voices rose in opposition. They spoke of caution, of fear. What if this knowledge was too dangerous to unleash? What if revealing the full extent of the lost civilization's wisdom could provoke chaos, disrupt religions, topple governments, even destabilize the fabric of society itself? These voices argued for restraint, suggesting that humanity might not be ready for such a radical shift. Some even spoke of suppressing the most potent elements of the discovery, fearing that certain knowledge, in the wrong hands, could lead to cataclysmic consequences. The debate stretched late into the night, and with each passing hour, the pressure mounted. The scholars, torn between their desire for truth and their understanding of the power they held, found themselves caught in the middle of a philosophical and moral struggle unlike any they had ever imagined. The decision before them was nothing short of monumental. Should they release the full truth, potentially altering the course of human history forever? Or should they withhold the most dangerous aspects, preserving the status quo, but at the cost of living in the dark? One by one, the factions made their case, the weight of their words echoing in the room. The room itself seemed to shift. What had once been a space of collaboration now felt like a battlefield. Each side was determined to sway the scholars, to ensure that their version of the truth would prevail. The global leaders, with their political and personal stakes, pushed for control, while the intellectuals argued for enlightenment. And the shadowy figures of secret societies, ever watchful, reminded the room of the delicate balance of power that had been carefully maintained for centuries. The scholars were given a final moment to speak, but the room was quiet. Their words had the power to shape the future, but even they couldn't fully grasp what would come next. As they stood, Each contemplating the monumental choice before them, they realized something. There was no turning back from this decision. The truth, whatever it may be, was now unstoppable. And in that silence, the question hung in the air. What if the fate of humanity hinged on a single decision, and the wrong choice could change the course of history forever? As the summit neared its conclusion, one final vote would determine whether the world would be changed forever, or whether the ancient knowledge would remain hidden, buried beneath layers of political maneuvering and moral conflict. The choice had been made, but its consequences would unfold in ways no one could predict. The moment the decision was made, the world seemed to hold its breath. The knowledge, long hidden in the shadows of history, was now out in the open, and its impact began to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. At first, the reactions were chaotic. People were caught between excitement and fear. Some viewed the ancient wisdom as the key to unlocking a brighter future, while others saw it as a dangerous force, too powerful and unpredictable to wield. It was as if the floodgates had opened, and humanity was forced to confront the torrent of possibilities that rushed in. In some corners of the world, the revelation was met with a sense of awe and exhilaration. Nations once struggling with environmental collapse, political instability, and social inequality found new hope in the teachings of the lost civilization. Countries that embraced the wisdom quickly advanced in sustainability, technology, and social harmony. Cities began to thrive in ways previously thought impossible, harnessing energy from renewable sources, creating efficient urban ecosystems, and implementing systems that balance progress with preservation. The knowledge provided a blueprint for a new world, one that promised balance and enlightenment. Yet, in other parts of the globe, the reaction was far less optimistic. Societies began to fracture, unable to adapt to the rapid changes that had been unleashed. Governments that had been slow to embrace the knowledge found themselves caught in the crossfire. Civil unrest erupted as citizens, who had been kept in the dark for so long, demanded access to the wisdom that had been denied to them. Protests spread like wildfire, with people rallying against the systems that had oppressed them for so long. They demanded transparency, equality, and a chance to build a better future. Some governments, fearing the loss of control, doubled down on their attempts to suppress the knowledge. Censorship intensified, and secretive operations were launched to prevent the spread of information. But the more they tried to bury the truth, the more it spread. Underground networks, fueled by those who had glimpsed the potential of the ancient wisdom, began to rise. These factions, some seeking to protect and preserve the knowledge, others bent on using it to gain power, created a new kind of battlefield. The struggle for control over the lost teachings became a silent war, fought in the shadows, with alliances forming and fracturing with every passing day. The scholars, who had once dreamed of a world united by knowledge, now watched as their discovery tore at the fabric of society. They had opened a door, but they couldn't foresee what would come through it. The ancient wisdom, once a mere academic curiosity, had become a force that could not be tamed. It was both a blessing and a curse, promising a future of unparalleled potential while also exposing the deepest flaws within humanity. As the world plunged deeper into turmoil and transformation, one question lingered. What happens when the secrets of the past shatter the world we know? Will humanity rise to the challenge, or will it collapse under the weight of its own awakening? The consequences had only just begun. and the true power of the knowledge was still unknown. What would the future hold for a world that had awakened to its own potential and its own darkness? Would the lessons of the past be enough to guide humanity? Or would they prove to be a burden too heavy to bear? In the aftermath of their discovery, the scholars stood quietly in their study, surrounded by the same books and manuscripts that had once sparked their curiosity. They had unearthed a truth that had shaken the very foundation of the world. And yet, the world was not the only thing changed. They too had been transformed. Some of the scholars were hailed as heroes, their names etched into history as the ones who had unlocked the secrets of a lost civilization. They were celebrated in the media, their work lauded for its profound impact on humanity. The ancient knowledge they had uncovered was seen as a key to a new era, one that promised harmony, sustainability, and enlightenment. Those who embraced these teachings looked forward to a future where society could flourish in balance with nature, where technology would serve the common good, and where humanity would finally reach its potential. It was a vision that had captured the imaginations of millions, a vision that seemed within reach. But for others, the weight of their discovery was far heavier. They withdrew, haunted by the growing realization that some knowledge was better left buried. As the teachings of the lost civilizations spread across the globe, it became clear that there were those who sought to use this wisdom for darker purposes. Those who saw the potential for power in these teachings. Those who believed that they could manipulate the ancient knowledge for political, economic, or spiritual dominance began to shape a new kind of power. The scholars had hoped to inspire a world of enlightenment. But now they saw how easily this wisdom could be twisted into something far more dangerous. The ancient teachings, once viewed as a guiding light, now cast long shadows. As new leaders emerged, claiming to be the rightful inheritors of the lost civilization's wisdom, the world began to fracture. Some leaders used the knowledge to establish authoritarian regimes, cloaking their desire for control in the language of enlightened governance. They presented themselves as the stewards of a new era, promising peace and prosperity, but in reality, they were consolidating power in ways that resembled the very systems of control the lost civilization had once rejected. The knowledge was no longer a symbol of liberation. It was a tool of domination. On the other side, revolutionary movements began to rise, fueled by the same knowledge, but with a different vision. These movements sought to challenge the old power structures, using the teachings to ignite a global awakening, calling for equality, freedom, and justice. The world, it seemed, was standing at a precipice. The lines between progress and destruction had blurred. The fate of humanity was being shaped by the same knowledge that had the potential to both heal and divide. Amidst this turmoil, the scholars came to a sobering realization. They had only uncovered a fraction of the wisdom contained within the ancient teachings. The last part of the manuscript, the final piece of the puzzle, remained hidden, its full meaning still elusive. The symbols on the final page were fragmented, the writing incomplete, leaving behind only hints of greater secrets buried deep within the past. These secrets, if unlocked, could either solidify humanity's future or bring it crashing down. The final page of the manuscript glowed softly in the candlelight, its incomplete symbols mocking the scholars' efforts. They knew that the answers they had uncovered were only part of a much larger mystery, one that had been waiting for millennia to be revealed. And with the knowledge now in the world, they were left with a question that they had no answers for. Is this the end of the story? or merely the beginning of something far more dangerous? The scholars sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The fate of humanity was no longer in their hands, yet they couldn't help but feel responsible. They had started this journey, but they had no idea where it would lead. They could only watch as the world moved forward, shaped by the very secrets they had uncovered. Some hoped that humanity would rise to its potential, embracing the knowledge with wisdom and humility. Others feared that the world was headed for disaster, driven by greed, ambition, and a thirst for power. As the camera pulled back, the scholars remained in the dim light of their study, staring at the flickering candle beside the incomplete manuscript. The silence was heavy, filled with the weight of their discovery and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The future, once so full of promise, now seemed clouded with doubt, and the question remained: could humanity rise to meet its destiny, or would it fall victim to its own ambition? The screen faded to black, leaving the audience with the final thought that would linger long after the credits rolled. The truth is a mirror. What we see in it is not the mirror, but ourselves. In that quiet, lingering moment, the mystery of the lost civilization was no longer just a story of the past. It had become a reflection of humanity's own nature, our greatest potential, and our deepest flaws. The ancient knowledge was not merely a key to unlocking the past, but a mirror to our own souls. The decision of what to do with it was no longer theirs to make. It was up to the world. And as the credits rolled, the story of the lost civilization remained unresolved, waiting for the next chapter to be written by the hands of those who would shape the future. The world, it seemed, was only just beginning to understand the true power of the knowledge it had been given. And whether that power would be used to heal or to harm would depend on how humanity chose to wield it.